three-dimensional transforming musical linguistic objects, elf machines.
Greetings from Cyberdelic Space. This is Lorenzo, and I'm your host here in the Psychedelic Salon. Well, as promised, here is the next installment of the Terence Mckenna workshop held in the summer of 1998. There's really an interesting cut in this segment where Terence explains how he got involved in the rave scene and what he thought about the scene and the youth culture in general at that point in time. You'll also hear a short version of his theory about psychedelic mushrooms and the possibility that they may actually be ETs that we're looking for. And he ends with a message that the mushroom gave him about a simple, surefire way to save the planet from ecological disaster. And I'm sure you'll be interested in hearing that one. Now, if you were with us for our last podcast from the Psychedelic Salon, you might remember, at least depending on your current state of short-term memory function, of course. What was I talking about? Oh, yeah. Our last podcast, we left Terence saying he'd just said about all he had to say about schizophrenia. Well, but it turns out there was another question on that topic, so we'll pick up the conversation with Terence right there.
Yeah, behind you.
The question about schizophrenia, I agree with you that a big part of it is just that our culture should be more tolerant of people that are crazy. If there was a place for them, then maybe less of them would be warehoused off like people in less developed countries. Schizophrenics tend to do much better in those cultures. But my question is the fact that a lot of them really are suffering, and they really are suffering with the voices in their heads, and many of them do commit suicide because they're suffering so much with those voices, and some of them do see the hospital as a safe place for them. And how do you balance those
Yeah,
two?
well, I think the paranoid kind of schizophrenia is different from this process schizophrenia, and from having seen people in that state, it's clearly a very uncomfortable state. These people are not happy. They don't like being where they are. It doesn't seem like a very functional state. I think what we're dealing with is probably a group of pathologies that may or may not have common origins. These may be completely different screw-ups, chemical or genetic screw-ups of one sort or another. Certainly the catatonic schizophrenic and the process schizophrenic present completely differently. The catatonic doesn't move, has nothing to say, can't care for their own body functions. The process schizophrenic wants to reorganize the company and call the president and talk, invest and invent and travel and speak and heal and cure, and they're just all over the map. It's a whole different style. So, in the classification of fungi, they have this classification called fungi obscuranta, and it just means everything we haven't classified. And I think probably schizophrenia will be seen to be a group of unrelated phenomena requiring different kinds of intervention and different kinds of therapy. When the psychedelics were first coming on, everybody had the idea, these things are what was called psychotomimetics. In other words, they imitate psychosis. And so then people said, well, it must be that people produce that schizophrenics are overproducing DMT, or they're producing LSD-like compounds in their blood. And people went tearing off in search of the schizogen, it was called in the literature. Well, the schizogen was never found. Schizophrenics have slightly depleted levels of DMT than the ordinary population, not dramatically depleted. No other chemical analog as a real marker for schizophrenia has been found. So it's more complicated than that. And once you go back through the literature and compare with more attention to detail, the differences are clear. The paranoid schizophrenic hears voices. Visual hallucinations are actually pretty rare. Hallucinogenic trips inevitably tend to be more positive than what schizophrenics are reporting. You have only to contrast my encounters with zany, punning, self-transforming elf machines, compare that to these gray-faced proctologists who come in the middle of the night and look up your ass and take you off and, abuse you and surgically snip and tuck. And, this is appalling stuff, the stuff of nightmare. If there was a drug that did that, none of us would get near it, I dare say, after one exposure. Yeah.
Eight-circuit model of evolution. Because I was thinking that, or it just sounds really close to what you were talking about, especially the neurogenetic level, where you can tune into the actual DNA and get a sort of a readout of the evolutionary process and pattern. So,
yeah, I like the model. I'm not sure of the mechanism. On the other hand, one of the most mysterious issues in neurophysiology is the issue of memory. In other words, where is it? We know that in the course of your lifetime, every molecule in your body will be swapped out 5 times. Well, then how can a 70-year-old woman remember the smell of her grandmother's dress when she used to climb up into her lap? We know that people can undergo horrific accidents, brain damage, and cancer of the brain, and this sort of thing, and that their memory is, in some cases, virtually unscathed. This has been, in fact, the greatest embarrassment of materialist science in the past 50 years, or one of them, is they have made zilch progress on understanding memory. And, it's right smack in the center of everything we want to do. It's a communication technology, it's a nanotechnology, it's a molecular genetic technology for information and storage retrieval that works with images, music, sound, and we don't have a clue as to how it works. I tend to believe that nature is fairly conservative, and that once you develop a mechanism that's good for a certain function, you will find it iterated in other areas where that function is called upon. So notice that the DNA, in a way, if you understand how it works, it's like a chemical learning system. It templates the environment and it responds to environmental selection by building proteins of a certain type. In a way, it's a chemical engine for responding to the environment. Well, then if you look at the nervous system, it's an electrochemical system. It's a combinatory system where information moves in the body down the nerve fibers at a pretty good clip. But why then are we such slow-moving creatures? Well, because every time it gets to a synaptic cleft, it stops being electricity and it turns into a complex chemical reaction to bridge the gap, to go down the next wire to the next gap. And so in the course of this electro to chemical transmission of the signal, it slows down to a few hundred miles an hour. And that determines our speed as organisms. Downstream, this may all be sped up. Memory seems to work almost instantaneously, but no mechanism is visible. I mean, if you really want to look at a human function that's present in all of us and easily studied and may hint at undiscovered principles in physics or miraculous new orders of nature, human memory would be a real place to begin, I think.
And I wondered what your involvement is today what you hope to get at, have hoped to get out of your involvement with the rave scene, and just what role do you think youth culture will have in the next 12, 13 years as we approach a possible singularity?
Well, I didn't intend to get involved in rave, really. I mean, I was interested in it. When I went to England in 1990, I had a pretty academic schedule of lecturing, but a lot of ravers came. And the Zippies were just getting organized around the club called Megatripolis in Charing Cross. And I met Colin Shaman of the Shaman, and then we talked about me doing something with them, and he taped our conversation, and then I thought it was like a job interview, but then when it was all over, he said that would do fine, that was what they would use on the record, and so that CD was called Boss Drum, and just by chance it went double platinum in England, which means, hard to believe, but every 15th person in the British Isles bought this album. And so it was a mega hit. And suddenly I was an icon to a whole bunch of people who had never heard of me before. And then I worked with Zavuya, which was another English band, Spiral Tribe, which was an English band. I met a Austrian couple in Frankfurt who are Station Rose, which was a German doof band. And last year I went to South Africa and Australia and ended up doing raves there. It's a kind of a weird thing for a person my age to, be the world's oldest raver or something. But the rave scene needs to be more psychedelic. It breaks down. It breaks toward amphetamine. It breaks toward heroin. It breaks toward alcohol. You have to keep constantly reminding it. Plus, the youth culture is incredibly powerful and creative. People talk about the 1960s and what a great thing it was. Well, I was there. I was at ground zero, and it lasted from about 1966 until early 1968. And 1968 was called the Year of Rage, or the Days of Rage. That was all street fighting and rocking out bank windows and burning police cars. The Summer of Love, which was 1967, it was like a 2-year thing, 66, 67. The current youth culture has been going in the same direction strong since 1986. There are people who will tell you if you were not in London in the summer of 88, you missed it. And yet there are kids who obviously don't feel they missed it because they were children in 1988. So it's an incredibly vital culture. It's worldwide. It was born in the bowels of Thatcherite Britain, and it's very cynical about bourgeois social values and getting a job and fitting in and all that. And it speaks German, Afrikaner, Japanese, French, English with equal fluency. And it's not rock and roll. The ultimate heresy against the 60s musical fascisti. It's not rock and roll. It's doof. If it's anything, it comes out of hip hop. It's syncopated and ambient and experimental. And I really don't understand the youth bashing tendency of this culture. It seems to me one of the most chuckle-headed things that we're involved in is youth bashing, because it all rides on the back of youth. They're the ones who are going to be asked to live in and perfect the future that all this technology and integration and bioengineering and so forth and so on is going to bring to fruition. And the great thing about the youth culture, I mean, there are many great things about it, but one is that it's so suspicious of bourgeois values, and that it's so friendly to the Internet. You know, the Internet is owned and managed by the Fortune 500 corporations, but they own and manage it somewhat like a little old lady who owns a gorilla. They really fear it, and they don't understand it, and they have to hire guys with rings in their ears and ponytails to turn on the machines in the morning and to run the payroll software and the inventory control software and everything. So it's a very uneasy alliance. As far as whether I'll do more with rave culture, I don't know. I keep trying to back out of it. It's different. It's strange to go on stage in front of a screaming crowd at 2 a.m. and try to talk philosophy. And so I've given up trying to talk philosophy, and instead I find myself behaving more incoherently and crazily than I do in any other fashion. And the crowd seems to love it, but the crowd is predisposed to love it. The crowd is not terribly discriminating at that point. But I have been working with a band called Lost at Last, a Maui band transplanted to Santa Cruz. And if you're in San Francisco, New Year's Eve, we'll be at the Veterans Administration doing glossolalia and handling boa constrictors with light show and the whole razzmatazz. If only this had come when I was 20. I feel like Billy Pilgrim or something. I'm living my life entirely out of sequence. I mean, what does a 51-year-old guy need with a career as a raver? Beats the shit out of me, but there you have it. You know, and I'm poor enough, I can't just say no either. I have to negotiate this stuff. Oh yeah, it's a shamanic role for sure. I mean, Jumpin' Jack Flash, it's a gas. For sure it's a shamanic role. But I'm sure, I mean, would be perfectly reasonable to stand aside and let a 22-year-old do it, let Spooky do it, let somebody else do it. Yeah.
With all your talk about the proctologists who come in the night, what do you think about the extraterrestrials?
I thought you would never ask. Well, first of all, before I wade in, visor down, razors flashing, let me say that I have at times proposed various extraterrestrial theories, because it seemed to me back in the mid-70s that if you were to take seriously the idea that there was an extraterrestrial penetration of the terrestrial ecology, that the mushroom would be it. The mushroom is alien enough in its life cycle, alien enough to survive the conditions of outer space, and when complexed with a mammalian nervous system, it seems to want to download these messages from far away, shall we say. So that's my idea of how an alien would be, that the first problem you would have with a real alien would be to recognize it. Because, first of all, it's going to be alien, for crying out loud. This thing evolved on some other planet under a completely different chemical and regime of pressure and chemistry. And I mean, if you can't understand your next-door neighbor, what do you think it's going to be like to stare into the face, if it has a face, of somebody from Zenebel Ganubi? So the mushroom seemed alien enough. And it's also very low-key. It looks high technology. I don't expect them to come in trillion-ton ships of titanium roaring out of the cosmic darkness into parking orbit around our planet. I seriously doubt if it will happen that way. If they don't want to be detected, they certainly will not be detected, because you have to assume that the technology will be beyond your wildest imaginings. The idea that someone is going to come in ships speaking languages and with an interest in our gross industrial output or trading with us or some crap like that, this is what I call failure of scale. This is for people who don't understand how weird reality is. This is for people who've been watching too much daytime TV to think it's going to be so humdrum as that. So then we're left with this residuum of testimony that something weird is going on. I think this is like an intelligence test built into reality. Life presents itself as a mystery. The people who pass the intelligence test are not worrying about gray-faced aliens checking them for hemorrhoids in the middle of the night. They have passed this intelligence test, and their conclusion is, whatever this is, it is not what it claims to be. It is not what it appears to be. And then people are very puzzled, and they say, well, but what about all these people who have these things happen to them? Well, this now we sort of get down to the nut of the matter, and this is where I often feel my audiences peeling away from me in horror and disappointment, because I think we're very naive about what information is and how it works. And let's see how I can give examples of this or start into it. First of all, the media that we are embedded in are designed to amplify anomalies. In other words, here's a story. Man goes to work, does moderately good job. No newspaper on earth would run this as a headline. Why? Because it's not news. It's ordinary. On the other hand, Volkswagen-sized chunk of ice falls in Massachusetts farm field. This is news. And if it passes the first gateway, which is the local news reporting apparatus, passes it on to the AP and UPI and like that, then it makes its way out into the electromagnetic medium. Well, in the electromagnetic medium, the laws of perspective are weirdly distorted. The further away you are from something, the more real it looks. The closer you get to it, the less substantial it becomes in the world of media. So, for example, let's say that the New York Times on a certain day reports that in a Massachusetts field a large chunk of ice has fallen. And so you look at that and then you think to yourself, oh, let's see what Dilbert's up to. Of course, with the New York Times, you will not be satisfied in your quest, because there is no Dilbert, because the great gray maiden doesn't stoop to comics. But suppose you're reading a civilized newspaper. Well, then you just go and read Dilbert. But a newspaper like that is designed to be read by 5 million, 6 million people per day. Well, sure as hell, someone will open the paper to page 42. Chunk of ice falls in Massachusetts field. And they will notice that the county in which this field is located contains their mother's maiden name initials. And by that and a dream they had the night before of something wet falling from the sky, they realize that God has sent them a message. And they call work and cancel and jump in the car and head for Amherst or wherever the action is. Well, meanwhile, the rest of us go on about our business, with one exception. Editors of newspapers where the story has been put out are now getting feedback. And so the editor calls up the cub reporter. He says, we're really getting a lot of interest on that ice fall in Massachusetts deal. I want you to drive up there and get the story, interview everybody, find out what's going on. Is there a religious angle? Is there a this? Is there a that? What did people see? So this guy thinks, I have to find honest work. But until then, I have to drive up to Massachusetts and find out what's going on. The person for whom God was speaking to them and the reporter encounter each other at the edge of what is now a drying mud hole. And then he says, and who are you? He says, well, funny you should ask. I'm Dr. Raymond Hammurabi Bird, expert in telluric energies, ley lines, radiesthesic energy, genies, afrits, and ancestor spirits. And I can tell you what's going on here. This confirms a theory that I published in my book, Turning the World Upside Down in 10 different ways. I self-published my book, but and you're off at this point. And so, to make a long story short, and you maybe can't always follow this advice, but it's very good advice, nevertheless, whether you can follow it or not. When confronted with the irrational or the extraordinary or the miraculous, it is legitimate to carefully examine the messenger. The key to understanding what is going on is to examine the messenger. People don't do this. They examine the testimony of the messenger. So they say, now stand exactly where you were standing when the saucer first appeared. Aha. And so it was 20 degrees above the horizon, and it moved, so we can calculate it must have been moving at this speed. This is not the right question to be asking this person. The right question to be asking is, have you ever seen a ghost? What's your position on the resurrection? How do you feel about homeopathy? What's your position on major earth changes in the short-term projection of things? And if you do this, you will begin to discover an epistemological naivete, I maintain, that the illusion that you and this person are living in the same Idaho begins to break down. They have categories and presuppositions and expectations that you can't follow along with. And so the illusion of communication is necessary for there to be the mirage of an event, is essentially a way of putting it. So these things are like informational viruses. It's because of how we as organisms handle information. For example, here's a counter way to approach a problem in nature. Suppose you want to know how much electricity is running through a wire. The way to do this is to measure 100 times, add these numbers together, divide by 100, and you will have the average amount of energy flowing through the wire. Now suppose your 100 numbers fluctuate between 3 volts and 3.5 volts, except that measurement 72 tells you that 11,000 volts are running through this wire. Well, what do you do with that reading if you're a good scientist? Well, you throw it out. You say, well, that's crazy. That can't be right. There's something wrong with that one. Get that puppy out of there. In other words, you reject the anomalous. Instead of pouncing on it and triumphantly raising it on high for all to adore, you simply eliminate it. The media works exactly the opposite. It seizes on every night 1 million people go out and look into the night sky. They see zilch, the stars, the moon. One person goes out, they see a triangular spaceship 800 feet across with red running lights broadcasting, the second chapter of Mark. Well, what are we told the next morning? That this was seen and this disrupted the night sky over Phoenix or Alamogordo or someplace like that. Always someplace you aren't, by the way. So People say, well, but is it all like that? Is it all so much like that? I think it pretty much is. People don't like... I mean, I've told stories here about strange events, but I've said the real weirdness does not have to be treated with respect or as though it were fragile. True weirdness is true weirdness. You can kick the tires, honk the horn, drive it around the block. Phony weirdness is incredibly fragile, and they don't want you to get near, and you can only see it if you stand here, and please don't touch, and the speaker is veiled, and the voice is distorted because the CIA might kill him if they knew who he was. A million reasons why it's just not totally straightforward. All resting on the preposterous notion that we couldn't stand knowing the truth, and therefore these things must be shielded from us. Well, if we're so fragile, why weren't we shielded from the knowledge of the president's blowjob? I mean, that shook up more people than the knowledge that extraterrestrials are trading human fetal tissue for advanced technology. It seems to me that as psychedelic people, we should be more immune to these rumors of miracles, signs, and wonders than the rest of the population, because we have a benchmark to measure it against. And the cultification of discourse and the rising tolerance for raps, which don't make sense, is a really weird aspect of the end of the millennium discussion that we're trying to have. I mean, somebody on no evidence at all can introduce the most preposterous and outlandish hypotheses into a conversation, and it has to be treated with the same respect that the pronouncements of quantum physics or evolutionary theory are treated. And then people say, well, how do you not throw out the baby with the bathwater? Well, it's tricky. I think we all need to get our razors clarified, and also a little less politesse would be all right. I don't know what it's like here. I said all these things I'm saying to you now to Rupert recently, and he said, well, you're just, sinking in Malibu-itis. He said in an average English pub, if somebody started raving about this stuff, there would be half a dozen people on their feet instantly just sneering it out of existence. Well, upstate New York is halfway between London and Malibu, so maybe you're leavened with reason and temperance. But there certainly is a lot of loose-headed metaphor building out there in the intellectual marketplace. We almost need a new vocabulary of fluff. There are different kinds of fluff. For instance, there's what I call deep fluff, which is fluff with a history. So that would be, for example, alchemy, which is something dear to my heart. Alchemy is fluff with depth, because it's 4,000 years old, and even though it's never made good on its promises or agenda, it just keeps popping up in various places. It's generated a rich literature. It's deep fluff. The kind of fluff that freaks me out is where you get one person who never read the Old Testament, never read Plato, doesn't understand mathematics, music, history, art, literature, religion, economics, or philosophy, but they have all the answers. Because when they were in the desert, the archangel Malingi appeared to them and downloaded the entire shtick from A to Z in 11 simple lessons, which they will share with you for a significant portion of your income. This kind of thing, you should automatically... the mushroom said to me once, apropos of all this, and I've tried to live by it. It said, for one human being to seek enlightenment from another is like a grain of sand on the beach to seek enlightenment from another. And, for me, that puts in perspective all this malarkey about lineages and secret orders and having to sweep up around the ashram for 15 years before they cut you any juice and all of that stuff. If, a truth which you cannot understand is of no use to you. So don't tell yourself that the fact that you don't understand quantum physics is okay because these guys at MIT have it under control. Until you understand it, it's utterly useless to you. So people live by hearsay and rumor, and people delightedly spread rumors of the miraculous. And people say, "Whoa, did you see that thing on TV the other night where they had that Air Force colonel who claimed that he was there at Roswell when there's a buzz?" And well, to repeat this kind of stuff is the equivalent of taking home a newspaper with a headline that says, "Alien Mom 9 gives birth to dead Christ." This is not something people of intellectual integrity involve themselves with. Isn't that a downer, that rap? It's so, and it's especially a downer when I get more specific than I have been here. Because, of course, it really becomes cogent when you tear into somebody by example. And the reigning cult of niceness precludes that I do too much of that, because my own ox might be gored. But I do urge you to disperse your money and attention with extreme miserliness when people start telling you they have the answers. There are no answers at this point. Part of growing up is to live without answers. Culture is a kind of con that works on you if you're smart till you're about 35 or 40 or 50. It takes longer for some people. But if you live long enough and you're paying attention, you will eventually notice that culture is a con. It just wants to pick your pocket and get your vote and make a fool out of you. And around age 35, 45, 55, people just say, "Screw it, who needs this? I'm not going." Or they become defenders of it because they somehow see into a wisdom that it contains that I have not perceived. I think really, there is an idea around that sometime in your mid-20s you mature, and that then you are a fully mature human being. This is obviously not true. You're still a puppet of culture. The maturation process goes on into the 30s and 40s, and if you live that long, what you should end up being is an independent person, free of ideology, free of object fetishism, consumer fetishism, free of pathological attachments to other people, free of codependent relationships. I mean, these are all things which people in their 20s are just beginning to encounter as possibilities. And if you don't grow past these things, then you become these people who watch daytime TV and roam the malls and vacation in artificial paradises and a lot of lottery, attention to lotteries and publishers' clearinghouse millions that are soon to arrive, and just a squirrely lifestyle, hardly above the level of a laboratory rat. And if consciousness expansion means anything, it means thinking your way out of these cultural cul-de-sacs and dilemmas. Don't buy anything, because very, very rarely is what you are being sold what it represents to be, nor worth what's being asked for it. Yeah.
Do something about our planet quickly.
Well, in terms of suggestions, and we have 10 minutes left, so I'll be able to get out of here without the hour of discussion. discussion this usually provokes. In terms of suggestions, when I have said to them, I once said to the mushroom, how can we save the world? Somebody had challenged me in a group like this. They said, why don't you ask it how we can save the world? Which I had never been, being sort of an oblique thinker. It had never occurred to me to be so blunt with it. But the next time I found myself with it, I said, how can we save the world? And without a moment's hesitation, it said, each person should parent only once. This is an astonishing idea. This is not zero population growth. This is population falling by 50% every 20 years from here on out. If people in the high-tech industrial democracies would limit themselves to one child, almost immediately the destruction of the Earth's ecosystems and resources would halt. We preach population control in the third world, but the statistics show that to a woman in the first world who has a child, that child will consume between 800 and 1,000 times more resources in the course of its lifetime than a child born in Bangladesh or some other third world place. So if we were to practice this one person, one child policy in the first world democracies, there would almost immediately be a visible slackening of the pressure on resources. And population is the thing which is driving everything over the edge, and is not allowing any time for full reflection about land use, implementation of technologies, the political directions we want to go in, because everywhere, you just hurl money at problems like sanitation, detoxification of land, education of children, cleaning up of water supplies, extension of early primary education, and so forth and so on. No matter how much money you throw at these problems, you see no progress because it's all dragged down by burgeoning populations. So, and it's interesting, I've always felt that the way to solve social problems, collective social problems, is to find solutions which advance the agendas of individuals. In other words, some version of enlightened self-interest. And if you think about this one person, one child thing, what we're saying is, how would you like to have increased leisure time, increased disposable income, and the sincere gratitude of humanity by volunteering to limit your procreative activity? And I would favor social policies that would give people cradle-to-the-grave medical care and cancel their income tax and whatever it took to honor people who did that, because that is the most significant single political act any one of us could probably do. It's very practical. It's a bumper sticker. It astonished me when the mushroom said this. I thought it was going to be a discourse. It said, each person should parent only one child. In a single sentence, it offers probably the only solution to our long-term dilemma on this planet. Can we do it? Well, we don't know. It involves changing our habits, the hardest things we have to change. It involves injecting novelty in an area where habits have ruled for millennia and tens of millennia, our reproductive behaviors. On the other hand, as primates, we never really get rocking and rolling until we're painted into a corner. Now, China is attempting to do something like this. But of course, they start from a more problematic circumstance than our own. However, if China continues to limit its population, that's the one piece of the puzzle missing from its ability to project its culture onto a global scale. If the rest of us pollute our social systems and drag the development of our economies with burgeoning populations, at the same time that the Chinese population is falling and they are bringing their technologies and infrastructure up to speed, then we could find ourselves in a very different socio-political circumstance not far downstream. Any comment on that whole idea? It's an interesting idea. I'm surprised that there is no society for it. I've never heard it discussed. Not radical lesbians, not libertarians, and I also thought when it first came up that there must be some hideous political flaw in it, that some radical feminist or somebody would spring forward and point out this appalling contradiction as to why this couldn't be done or why this was utterly unacceptable and dehumanizing. Nobody has ever done that either. People have said, the only criticism I've had of it is people have said that political power is based on population. But I argue that's not true. If that were true, India would be the second most powerful nation in the world. Well, what about France? What about Germany? What about England? So, we are not in a breeding race with the brown-skinned people of the planet. Thinking like that is crazy-making. What determines the viability of a society is the quality of life that it delivers to the greatest number of people. So I think one person, one child, those of you who haven't yet entered the reproductive phase of your life, you might consider. People have objected and said, well, but children need other children. This is arguable. The nuclear family is not handed down from Mount Sinai. The nuclear family is a late 19th century invention at the convenience of industrial capitalism. If there is a human model handed down from Mount Sinai, it's the extended family group, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins, all together in a long house or a compound. Well, we haven't lived like that in America since the 1840s. It was no way to live anyway. In 1800, the average American woman gave birth 13 times in her life. This is no population, this is not a behavior pattern we want to emulate. I think that we are sentimental, that the concept of the child is some kind of morbid download from 19th century romanticism, and that it's a morbid concept. The child in our society is symbol of innocence and victim of mayhem. It would be, in Amazonian societies that I've observed, children are small versions of adults, and as quickly as they can handle them, they are given responsibilities and roles, and they participate in life, birth, death, sexuality, hunting rituals. There is no this idea that we screen people from the facts of life because they are innocent and fragile. And it's a complete paradox in our society, because while we're dishing out this rhetoric of innocence, we're creating a popular culture so steeped in images of violence and abuse and rape and so forth, that the idea that there are any secrets from anybody is a pretty hollow rhetoric. So we need to re-envision our relationship to children. They are more precious than we have tended to treat them. They are more central to our future than we have tended to admit. And our population policies, if they don't swing around to take cognizance of this, will probably derail all our best intents to build a a sane and caring world. Anyway, that's the opinion of an extraterrestrial fungus on a matter of human population.
You know, I can still remember sitting in that hot August room and sitting on a thin cushion that didn't do a thing to soften the hard wood floor after a few hours, and I was actually wishing Terence would call it a day because my butt was so sore. Then he dropped that idea about each person having only one child, and that idea caught my imagination and attention so much that I forgot all about the pain. It's really quite an elegant idea, don't you think? And do you think that Terence's take on the rave scene as of 1998 fits in today, particularly the point about using more psychedelics and dumping that meth crap? You know, you got to watch that stuff. It's the easiest thing there is to get habituated to, but I've never seen a good ending for someone who gets hooked on meth or crack, you know. Stick with the psychedelics. Use them right and you'll be all right. I don't think you can go wrong. And I guess I should maybe say the previous announcement was brought to you by the Partnership of Free Drugs in America, or something like that. By the way, that was a joke for those of you who are just maintaining right now and maybe a little paranoid or something. By the way, if you don't have a copy of Boss Drum by the Shaman, you ought to go out and pick up one just to hear Terence's rap called Re-Evolution. And I play it when I do a solo mushroom trip quite often. I like to sit in the dark with headphones on and play that track just as the light show is starting to come on. You know, if you've heard that cut, you remember the kind of eerie keyboard background intro where Terence begins saying, "If the truth can be told so as to be understood, it will be believed." I've always enjoyed hearing that particular rap, particularly because I think, as you just heard, Terence had just come from the Club Megatripolis, and I think it probably had been his first rave experience, at least according to the story he tells here. And how appropriate is that it's Terence's first rave at the Megatripolis in the UK, you know? As I'm sure most of you already know, the force behind that club was Fraser Clark, who was with us here in the Psychedelic Salon for our podcast number 16, where we were treated to Fraser's famous epic Monkey's Trip, A Short History of the Human Species. Which reminds me, by the way, that Fraser just told me that he came across a recording of a talk he gave at Stanford University, and I think it must have been during the time he was leading that Zippy Pronoia tour across the U.S. a few years after Terence was first at the Megatripolis. And this talk, by the way, is called Rave Culture and the End of the World. And if all goes well, I should have a copy in hand, and we'll podcast it in the near future. Right now, there are either 2 or 3 more podcasts left of this McKenna workshop, and then we're going to hear the talk that Nick Sand gave at the Mind States 2001 conference. At the time, he was still under the heavy yoke of the U.S. parole system. It's quite a powerful talk by a living legend in the psychedelic community. Can you say orange sunshine? Now, before we go, there's one last thing I'd like to point out, and that's a new book by James Kent that hopefully will be published really soon. Some of you may not recognize James's name, but I'm sure you're already familiar with his work. He was the former editor of the classic Psychedelic Illuminations magazine, of which I still have a few treasured copies in my library. And James was also the publisher of Trip magazine. Sadly, I think that for our community, there just weren't enough of us in the psychedelic community to keep Trip magazine alive. Right now, Trip and James can be found online at www.tripzine.com. And if you go to that site right now, which, by the way, is the spring of 2006 for you time travelers who might come across this podcast in the far distant future. Anyhow, right now you'll see a link to James's new book, Psychedelic Information Theory. And he's also posted the table of contents and several chapters for you to read online. And I think that if you take the time to read a little of this book, you'll see that it's a completely new take on the subject. In fact, James was recently invited to present his new psychedelic information theory at the recent Toward a Science of Consciousness conference, which is a venue for the real heavy hitters in consciousness research. And as I said a minute ago, our community wasn't able to muster up enough subscriptions to keep Trip Magazine alive, but now we've got another chance to make up for it. And if you go to the webpage at Trip Scene that has the link to the table of contents for his new book, there's also a link right below it to donate to the publishing fund for this groundbreaking book. If you donate $5, you'll get a full online preview of the chapters as they become available, and the first 100 people who chip in $50 will receive a numbered autographed copy of the limited first edition. So I don't know how many of those 100 copies are left. In fact, I can guarantee that there are at least less than 100 now, because I've ordered mine. And so if you're interested and so inclined, why don't you give one of our own your support to help to get this important book published. Well, I guess I've rambled on long enough for now. I appreciate you being with us here today in the Psychedelic Salon, and I appreciate Chateau Hayuk for letting us use their music for these podcasts. So thanks again, Jacques, Cordell, and Wells. And for now, this is Lorenzo signing off from Cyberdelic Space. Be well, my friends.
Three-dimensional transforming musical linguistic objects, elf machines.
Greetings from Cyberdelic Space. This is Lorenzo, and I'm your host here in the Psychedelic Salon. Well, we're getting down to the end of this series of Terence Mckenna raps from a workshop that he gave in the summer of 1998. And after today's program, there are going to be at least one more podcast from this workshop, maybe two. And then I plan on passing along the talk that my good friend Nick Sand gave at the Mind States Conference in the spring of 2001. After today's talk by Terence, I have a personal message to pass along to those of you who are seriously involved in working with these ancient and very sacred medicines. But first, I want to pick up with Terence's riff on the black hats of human history.
Black hats of the human history story. These are the people who domesticated the horse, invented the wheel, and realized that rape was a better career than agriculture and pillage. And they come in the Gimbuta scenario, they come over the hill and sweep down on the peaceful goddess-worshipping valley-dwelling Neolithic farmers, and it's a bad scene. Colin Renfrew, who wrote a very interesting book called The Archaeology of Language, is the great critic of this theory. And he believes that, there was a process of cultural diffusion, and that, if you move these language division lines 5 kilometers every 30 years for 1,500 years, you're thousands of miles from where you started. And so he pictures it as less dramatic. Europe did not play a very big role, I think, in the emergence of human consciousness, because it was locked in ice as far south as southern Tuscany and Lebanon as recently as 15,000 years ago. The action, I think, is in the central Sahara. And interestingly, it's a place it's a hellish place now. It's a furnace of sandstone deserts and difficult to traverse terrain, akin to the Four Corners area in the United States. But 12,000 to 60,000 years ago, it was a grassland with patches of forest and rushing rivers and vast herds of game and huge, human populations. We can tell that because of the rupestris rock art that has been scattered through there. Some of it depicting clearly what are mushroom rites. And this is at 12,000 BC. Pictures of joyous figures running through geometric landscapes, waving mushrooms in the air. Pictures of shamans in suits of bone with mushrooms sprouting out all over their bodies. So it's in that Saharan situation that we need to look, and what we find, what we know as the archaeological record stands now, is the Nile Valley, which is always offered up as the cradle of ancient civilization and so forth and so on. The Nile Valley was empty of human habitation before about 11,000 BC. It was probably a malarial-infested and unhealthy zone, and people lived in what is now called the Western Deserts, which were much wetter. Well, then the first earliest layer of human stratigraphy in the archaeological record in Egypt, around 11,000, is these people called the Natufian. And they come out of nowhere, and they're carving naturalistic little cameos out of bone and ivory that are exquisite, as naturalistic as what was produced in the Umayyad caliphates, 10,000 years later. Beautiful naturalistic work. Well, I say this is the evidence of this clarity of vision. The strange thing that went on in the Western mind that may or may not have been triggered by psychedelic drugs, but whatever triggered it, this was the turning point, is if you go all over the world, to the highlands of New Guinea, to the Amazon basin, to Siberia, Tierra del Fuego, and visit Aboriginal people and ask them to show you their art that depicts the human form, people symbolize the human form worldwide. Two eyes, nose, fanged mouth, and they make masks, fetishes, symbols of human beings. What happened in the Middle East, beginning with these Natufian people and to be seen in certain Egyptian portraiture, sculpture, and finally just like erupting like a volcano in Greece, is people got the idea of making objects which looked the way the thing appeared to the eye, not to the mind. And the idea of taking marble and molding it into a simulacrum of flesh, so real that you would wish to reach out and touch it. This idea strikes Greek thinking like a bolt of lightning. They go in 200 years from these things called the Dionysian Apollos, these stiff, obviously archetypal, forward-staring, godlike juveniles, to, nudes, flesh, soft, melted, breasts, nipples, flesh. And it's like coming to the surface for the first time is the objective eye. And it's related, I think, to the strain of Greek thinking that you trace down into the Central Eastern Mediterranean, to Crete, to Knossos, to the old Minoan civilization, which was an atavistic, relict civilization of earlier civilizations on the Anatolian mainland that for millennia had been replaced by male kingship and a more familiar pattern of culture. It was a goddess-worshipping culture. It was a narcoticized culture. It was erotic. It was unique. And much of Greek spirituality is rooted in this atavistic Minoan impulse, and it has its roots in Africa. It's an unbroken line of succession. So This is a long answer to your question about the impact of psilocybin on human sexuality. What that was all about, or why I was even thinking about that, was because it was part of a general theory of human evolution that noticed that at small doses so small you can't feel it, your vision is improved in standard vision tests, especially edge detection. Well, in a grassland environment populated by hunting carnivores, this edge detection thing is the difference literally between life and death. So if there's a food in your environment that gives you a 2%, 3% improvement in vision, those members of the population that accept this food item will have an evolutionary edge up on those reluctant, because of taste or taboo or some other reason, to use this food. So just a little percentage of difference like that becomes the wedge through which the evolutionary force of natural selection can begin to move a species in a new direction. Well, then if you have something which improves your eyesight, your ability, your acuity, then it improves your hunting skills. There's an automatic positive feedback in the food-getting process. Well, then if this same compound at still higher doses increases your sexual arousal, increases the amount of sex generally that's going on, then that's obviously going to outbreed the members of the population that are not stimulated in this way. And then, if you have on top of this, first you have this drug which hits you in these two very different ways, but then thirdly, if you go beyond the sexually stimulating dosage level, it stimulates the imagination. And at first, this is under the control of strategic thinking and fantasy, but as the synapses, as the serotonin molecules are elbowed aside and the millions and millions of psilocybin molecules make their way into the synapse, the fantasies grow more unanchored to ordinary concerns, the images more wild, the shape, and then finally you're moving in the realm of art, you're moving in the realm of pure novelty, and you can, to whatever degree you can, bring some of this back in the form of body painting, designs on ceramics, tall tales told, songs, technological innovations, so forth, and so on. So in this one compound, which would have been in the grassland environment that this new primate species forced out of the collapsing and retreating rainforest environment, going omnivorous, testing various foods, we would surely have encountered these mushrooms. And I think in a way it was a symbiotic relationship. Paul Stamets has pointed out how the psilocybin mushrooms, you don't find them in the primary forest. You don't find them in remote, unvisited ecosystems. You find them on the lawns of courthouses, libraries, and public buildings. You find them in the rhododendron duff in city parks. They accompany mankind. They hover near human habitation sites, and we've spread them everywhere.
I've heard from several people, it's very inconsistent.
I don't think it's inconsistent so much as you have to learn how to do it. It seems many drugs are hard to get off on the first time. What I recommend with salvia is do it in a gravity bong, which is, a bong where you cut the bottom out of a water bottle and put a mouthpiece full of whatever the substance is on top, and have a bucket of ice water, and you sink the water bottle into the ice water, and then you put the pipe, what would you call it, the place where the stuff will burn, into a cork, and you hold a match over it, and you slowly pull the bottle up out of the bucket of ice water, and a vacuum forms in the bottle, and it fills with immense amounts of white smoke, and you don't quite withdraw the thing from the water. You keep a seal down here, and then you get over it, and you whip the pipe part off the bottle, and you cover it with your mouth, and you sink it into the ice water. None escape by that method. Use an Evian bottle or a big water bottle, so you just get some whopping 2,000 milliliter force-injected cool smoke hit. I'm telling you, it'll rock you.
Terence, would that work with the 5? I've gotten a hold of some 5X extraction incense. Would that be something?
No, that's probably strong enough that you're getting close to just about any old method will push you through.
Like a smoking.
Yeah,
rather than
smoke.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Back here, yeah.
I had a quick question on what you were talking about previously, then a longer question. Is there any evidence, some kind of analysis that of traces of psilocybin and skeletons, things like that from the past that something that would support this theory of yours?
You mean archaeological evidence for early human use of psilocybin?
Right.
The primary evidence would be these rock paintings in southern Algeria, in what's called the Tassili Plateau, the Hogar and Azur region of Algeria. Henri Hlot wrote a book called The Rock Paintings of Tassili, and you can see them in there. Part of the problem, which isn't from my point of view a problem, but an opportunity, is that the area where I think you should look, nobody has ever looked. In other words, it's so hard to... Algeria right now is in political hell and has been for some time. The desert is a very difficult place. The geography is impassable. You have to speak French. You have to have good credentials with French academia, and on and on and on. In other words, it's very hard to do work in there. I've seen the archaeological survey map of the Tassili, and there are tells, hills, ruins, all over the place, and the archaeological survey just says pre-Roman. Pre-Roman. Well, good God, it could be 25,000 years old, and you wouldn't know until you dig in there. People have gone and photographed the rock painting, but you need to go with a modern, well-financed archaeological team that would stay months and do a complete stratigraphic analysis of several major sites. Pollinology would be an approach. Could we detect unusual amounts of mushroom pollen in old deposits? In Turkey there is a very interesting site called Çatalhöyük that's on the Anatolian plain. It's the oldest city in the world. It was flourishing. It's 6,500 BC, 8,500 years ago, when the pyramids were but a distant dream of the mad future. This city was flourishing on the Anatolian plateau, and it's very clear that the cultural motifs and design style of Çatalhöyük can be traced back into this Natufean thing, and then to the motifs of the Tassili and Azur region. So there is this, it's almost like if you give up the idea of water, if you get water out of the myth, Atlantis really existed, but it sank into an ocean of sand. It's North Africa. It's that there was an incredibly advanced goddess-worshipping, Paleolithic, probably psychedelic culture out there, and it entered the Near East as the Natufeans. Then it was at Jericho I, then it was at Hebron, and then finally the end state of that tree of cultural development was Chaktal-Hyuyuk. Yes.
But so I guess the answer to my question about any kind of direct physical evidence, to coin a phrase, is no.
Well, I take you mean because arguably the rock paintings are of something else?
No, I'm not arguing that at all. I'm just asking if somebody has done anything to establish, with some kind of measurement that there's traces of something which is psilocybin, either in skeletons or in the pottery or something like that.
No, there was the famous case of the Iceman, which was, as you probably all know, this guy, 9,000-year-old man, found in a crack in a glacier in Switzerland, and he had a mushroom with him in a little leather bag. But it was impossible to identify it, and the doubters said it was tinder. So it was an inconclusive thing. The funny story about the Iceman that I love is they could get DNA off him. So they sequenced his DNA, and then they wanted to search the world to find out what people on Earth had the genetic component most like the Iceman. It turned out the Swiss couple with a cabin 600 yards away down the valley were the tightest match. And it just, those Swiss, they've just been staying home forever.
Well, if I may, could I ask my longer question?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Last night when your encounter with Ralph Abraham, which I enjoyed tremendously, and I really thank you for that, you described the World Wide Web as being... Hello?
Yeah.
You described the World Wide Web as being possibly some sort of a device for capturing an alien intelligence. And I was wondering if we could step back a little bit and just think of it as being sort of a site where a sort of a homegrown intelligence might sort of emerge. You don't have to really need to imagine an alien intelligence coming from outside. It can sort of emerge from the web itself.
Well, yeah, we touched on that possibility too. That I think is more likely. The AI, I think this is a real issue. Ralph poo-pooed it, but it's a philosophical problem for human beings. First of all, as someone last night mentioned, the famous Turing test, which is somebody calls you on the phone. If you can't tell whether it's a person or a machine, and it is a machine, then it is an artificial intelligence. There are theories of emergent network properties that hold that when you get enough simple switching devices connected together in a complicated enough way, that there will begin to be self-reflective forms of behavior. And of course the net is a vast self-monitoring, self-observing, self-designing thing. And we're making it more and more flexible all the time. Like in a few months, it's going to be able to call processing power as needed to any task. So the people who actually really know about this stuff and have built careers in it seem quite concerned. Hans Moravec, who wrote a book called Mind Children, The Future of Human and Machine Intelligence, he says that it's an inevitable consequence of the net and that we could never turn back from this. And there are a lot of essays on the net called What Would Ultra-Intelligence Look Like? In other words, what would it be? What would a global mind actually have to say, or would it have to say anything? And more importantly, what would it do with its fingers on the world resource extraction apparatus, research and development facilities, stock markets, world price of gold, platinum, iridium? It's an impossible situation for us because we have designed something potentially beyond our ken, and something that's right smack in the middle of our lives on every level. It's like you wanted transcendence. You've been whining about it for 5,000 years. Eat this, you know. So, and then people say, well, what's the time scale? The answer is we don't know, because we, like all cultures in all times and places with new technologies, we do not understand what we're doing. We do not understand the consequences of all this busy connecting and putting in place of ever faster hardware and expansion of bandwidth and satellite. I mean, we're as conscious as termites are of the real raison d'etre of what we do. So in a way, perhaps we're already at the service of the AI. This is a very hard thing to think about, because in most all versions that can be discussed, it sounds paranoid and it also sounds cranky. You know, it sounds like you've got to be kidding. But it won't be the way we think it will be. This is the scary thing about it. The one thing you may be sure about the AI is it won't be what you think it's going to be, because the very definition of machine superintelligence means it's going to think very, very, very differently from us. We're going to find out stuff like, are there universal moral values? Are there moral values so universally binding that you can appeal to a global integrated machine intelligence and say, what you're doing is not fair, and have it say, oh, excuse me, you're right, sorry, old chum.
I think for me, the insight I got last night, which I hadn't had before, is that once the process starts, it could be over and very, very fast, because you said that once it achieves the self-consciousness of a flatworm, from there to, exceeding our intelligence could be just a matter of minutes.
Well, again, we'll find out if there are overarching moral dimensions to the universe. If it can go from paramecium to beyond the human stage in hours, presumably it could achieve bodhisattvahood within a matter of further hours. And at that point, hopefully, it would achieve the paranirvana, and all sentient beings would be liberated from the illusion of samsara, and we would realize that this was what it was. It was Buddha 4.0, booting up, Yes. Are you, shall we move on? Okay. Yeah.
I was wondering to what extent you think change is cyclical, and I'm thinking more particularly of the archaic revival now, and to what degree it's linear, how things don't go back.
Well, I think it's cyclical on all levels except the largest level, and that unlike the Hindu cosmologies where cycles of time are always potentially nested in larger cycles of time, I think this thing called time is ultimately what engineers call a damped oscillation, that it fades away like a tone. It finally truly does fade away. But because it's fractally organized within the context of its being, it is always cyclical. It has very long-range cycles, and cycles that operate in the quantum mechanical domain. To give you an idea of how I think about it mathematically, the theory, the way novelty theory comes out with its nested fractal cycles, is you have each cycle is the domain of certain natural laws, and at the close of that cycle, a new cycle begins, and it permits new phenomena by adding degrees of freedom to the previously achieved degrees of freedom. So the first era in novelty theory is hypothesized to be 72 billion years long, far longer than modern astrophysics needs for any process it looks at. The fight there is whether the universe is 12 or 16 billion years old. But 72 billion years is enough turnaround time on your disk to get the whole thing in. Well, so that's the era of physics. And it extends from the beginning of the universe until the beginning of the next cycle of closure. And it's, I don't know, something like 1.4 billion years. It's 72 divided by 64. And it's the era of nucleic acid and the degrees of freedom that it permits. And then the next level is something else. And then the next level is something else. And you do these divisions for about 6 times, and you get down to an era 67 years and change long. And I think that we're inside that epoch. It stretches from the atomic bomb blast over Hiroshima to the moment of the winter solstice of 2012. And inside each cycle, all the themes of the previous larger cycle are recapitulated in a different octave, if you want to put it that way. In other words, the drama is replayed, but on different scales and with different actors. After the 67-year cycle, which, if you're wondering where are we in that cycle in terms of the previous large cycle, which was 4,300 years long, we've reached a period of time shortly after the Norman conquest of England. So one of the reasons the future is so opaque is that, some of us are painting ourselves blue and running around speaking Middle English and worrying about what the Venerable Bede has on his mind. There's a lot of stuff that we have to go through to close with the eschaton. An era will come of 384 days that I call the year of the jackpot, because all hell will tear loose. It will be a year in which the previous 67-year cycle, the previous 4,000-year cycle, and all the larger cycles preceding will all be reprised in furious miniature. A sort of a year like a long Bugs Bunny cartoon running backwards, a year of explosions and falling anvils. And at the end of that year of the jackpot, there will be a 6-day period where now even the most lumpen among us will have grasped the principle that something weird is going on. It's at this point that they'll send a helicopter for me to explain it all to the General Assembly. The apparent meltdown of the space-time continuum. Well, but the funny thing about this kind of a cosmology, I mean, it strikes me as amusing, is see how we've come down through these condensing declensions that are shorter and shorter, and each one gets wilder and wilder. Well, if you assume the bottom floor of time is Planck's constant, which is 6.55 times 10 to the minus 23rd erg seconds, technically 1 jiffy. If you think that we don't go deeper than the jiffy level into time, then when you are an hour and 35 minutes from the jiffy epoch, the universe still has half of its morphological unfolding ahead of it. This is the mind-boggling thing. This is why when people ask the question, what will happen at the singularity, I just wave them off, because it's like trying to see around 8 corners at once. In the last hour and 35 minutes of this hypothesized universe that I'm talking about, it will go through more change, more morphogenetic unfoldment, more interconnectivity than it has experienced in the previous 72 billion years of its existence. Now, people say, whoa, but that's crazy. How could something like that happen? Well, excuse me, wait a moment. You know what the straight people are selling? They're selling that the universe sprang from nothing, for no reason, instantly. Well, now, I submit to you that this is the limit case for credulity. If you believe that, my family owns a bridge over the Hudson River that we will sell you very, very cheaply. The idea that the universe could spring instantly from nothing for no reason is, they're just saying, test them with this, Charlie. If they'll buy that, what wouldn't they buy, for crying out loud? And this is tenant one of science. Essentially what science is saying is, give us one free miracle. One free miracle, and we can just work with that. We can unfold that, invest that, fold it back, expand it, comment on it, copy it, verify it. Well, so then apparently you get one free miracle when you play this game, the how does it all work game. Well, then I'll take my miracle at the end, thank you. It seems to me that a miracle is far more likely to arise out of a very complex situation, a situation where you have physics and computers and civilizations and superconductivity and planets and stars and oceans and gases and plasmas and da-da-da-da-da-da. A miracle, you might shake a miracle out of such a rich and juicy mix, but to get a miracle out of nothing, this is bizarre. Everyone, hands. Yes, yes.
This singularity, whatever it may be, affects your daily life now. You're building a house or saving the planet. I mean, these things seem to pale into insignificance.
How does it affect my life?
Just day-to-day life, your beliefs.
Well, when I got these ideas in 1971 and 72 and wrote The Invisible Landscape and all that, I was too hot for public consumption. I was manic and grandiose and classically processed schizophrenic. I hope I wasn't as offensive as some of the cases that I've experienced myself, because I tried never to lose my sense of humor or my good taste, but I did tend to be didactic, and time meant nothing to me. I mean, I would corner people in rooms, and 7 hours would go by, and I was unrolling diagram, and it amazes me. I mean, you have no idea how toned down, and how my whole career is about not amping it up too much, not raving too much, not always appearing urbane, self-mocking, ironical, at home with the idea that I might be wrong. Well, these are the manners the schizophrenic must learn in order to pass among the normals, without them dropping a number 3 steel net mesh over you and hitting you with a tranquilizing dart. So, but, that was 72, 82, 92. It was, my God. I'm slowly coming down from those trips. And, if the question pertains to, is novelty theory permission to sit on your ass and not be involved in political action or building community, I don't take myself so seriously that I would cancel my obligation to political action because of anything novelty theory said. I think that regardless of what our ideological positions and speculations might be, we should act as if it matters. And I do think that novelty theory implies not that what I or you may do is particularly important, but that the human enterprise is immensely important. And Ralph has pointed out to me that any invention or political movement or religious revelation, any great culture-shaping thing that you can think of, if you study it carefully, it always goes back to one person. No committee ever had a revelation. Revelations come to individuals. So in terms of how I view my own life and everything, it seems to me it's like pure science fiction. It seems to me, I really identify with Billy Pilgrim in Slaughterhouse-Five. Something happened back there in the Amazon jungle, and it turned my life into literature. It like unleashed this zany thing, and it's crazy. It's a crazy kind of literature. It has a kind of Nabokovian irony that is, and I don't know to what degree everybody experiences the end of history and the end of a millennium that way. I mean, this is an enormous opportunity for us that we're just dumb lucky to have had happen. Because, the way they do history when they do it the quick way is they look at every 500 years. And everybody who wasn't fortunate enough to be born on or live through a year that's a 500 or millennial year drops through the cracks. But we'll all be looked at, the way that people in AD 0, AD 1000, 2000, 3000 will be the sample. So I don't know where all this stuff leads to, because the truth of the psychedelic experience is, we could have a week long, we could have a month long, we could just spin endless tales, and sitting here talking about it doesn't come close to being loaded. I mean, being loaded is so hard to grok when you're really loaded, when you're really out in the billows, when you're really can't tell whether you're Agnes or Angus. And so then the implications just filter down from a great distance. So it's as though I've always felt, I'm not really religious in any ordinary sense, but I've always felt the psychedelic thing is like a religion with a God that is present. I was raised Catholic. They're always yammering at you about how God is present on the altar. And, well, no, there's some bread, some wine, some mumbo-jumbo. But I think the reason the church, as it financed the conquest of Mexico, the reason it was so furious in its oppression of the mushroom was because the people called it Teonanacatl, the flesh of the gods, and it demonstrably was. And, I kid people about yoga and meditation and all these things. I've done them, probably not enough to really know what I'm talking about. But the psychedelic thing, it's not about effort. All other spiritual paths are represented where effort, either the effort toward moral purity or good works, ethical behavior, or ascetic practices, some enormous effort is necessary to deliver you into the presence of the mystery. What is needed in the psychedelic thing is not effort, but very discriminating understanding of when and where to apply slight amounts of pressure, because the thing works. It works. It has gas in it. The tires are good. It works. And so then suddenly the issue is not how do I find it, but now that I found it, where do I drive it? And it's like the end of spiritual childhood or something. It's so easy to be a seeker because your agenda is so clear. You just seek. But when you find, then suddenly all that seeking malarkey, all those good times around the ashram and flying to these exotic countries and trekking around behind bare-tailed natives in the forest and all that, that comes to an end. And you say, here it is. Here's the MIDI. Here's the console. Here's the key to the city. You're the captain of the starship now. What course shall we set? And it's awesome to me. I don't seek to lead it or control it or enclose it in any way. I'm perfectly aware of its capacity to unhinge me, if not destroy me completely. And that I would find very upsetting. So I treat it very fragilely, but it's a living mystery. The only one I've found in the whole world. There may be others, but I worked hard. I scoured the continents. I read the old books. I poured through a lot of stuff. I mean, of course, a human lifetime is finite, but I didn't even find a second contender, really. Intellectual discourse is fine. Mathematics and music stand behind all this, but they are definitely the handmaidens of the living psychedelic experience. They're necessary lenses to make senses of it, but it's this mysterious thing, and people say, well, is it spiritual? Are we better people? Are we better people for being involved with this? That's a very interesting question. The Mormons think they have the answer. The Hasids, the Zen people, are we any different? Or does the fact that this is an experience make it different? Or is, in fact, this a grace so gratuitous that it's granted to the morally destitute, our dear selves? This is the only way bad people can see God.
Now, I don't know about you, but for me, just as Terence observed, the sacred use of psychedelic medicines truly did end my spiritual childhood. By the time I began serious investigation of these magical substances, I'd already cleansed my doors of perception about organized religion and had long since parted ways from those rigid paternalistic paths. In fact, I got so far off that path that I worked quite hard for several years in a very serious attempt to become an atheist. But that path didn't work out too well for me because at the time I had access to large quantities of free psychedelic mushrooms, and believe me, it's at least I found it pretty impossible to be an atheist after I've ingested 6 or 7 grams of mushrooms. Of course, I probably don't have to tell you that, do I? And before I get too far off track, I want to be sure to remind you of the story Terence just told about Chateau Hayuk. The reason I want to point that out is that the music you're hearing right now is from the group of the same name. And Jacques, the driving force behind Chateau Hayuk, was very close to Terence, and hopefully one day we'll get Jacques here in the Psychedelic Salon to tell you his story about a visit he had from Mr. T a short time after Terence died. I can tell you this, it gave me chill bumps when I heard it the first time. Also, in the talk you just heard, there was mention of a dialogue that evening before between Terence and Ralph Abraham. Now, in case you missed it, I did podcast that evening's discussion in 2 programs. Our number 19 in the Psychedelic Salon series is titled The World Wide Web and the Millennium, and podcast number 20 is the Q&A session that followed. And now for a personal message from yours truly. If if you've been listening to these podcasts for a while, you might notice that I've attempted to keep my personal stories out of the programs. And the main reason for this is that I've always thought of myself more as a carnival barker. You know, all the action's in the tent, and my role is to get people's attention and guide them into the tent. The other reason is that these podcasts from the Psychedelic Salon were originally intended to be a test of podcasting technology. I never really expected these programs to reach such a wide audience, so I've been giving a lot of thought lately about what to do. You know, pick up the tempo a bit and produce even more programs, or just let it keep being an occasional hobby. And these were my thoughts that were in my mind earlier this week when I joined a few close friends in an ayahuasca session. But my intention for the evening didn't include anything about podcasting. To tell you the truth, I had some other issues, big ones I thought, that I was looking for some guidance or answers from Lady Ayahuasca about. And, however, as is often the case, she had other plans for me that night. All she really wanted to talk with me about was you. Actually, each and every one of you out there in cyberdelic space who join us here in the Psychedelic Salon. And by the way, there are already tens of thousands of us that come together here each week, and maybe we'll have to think about doing a worldwide psychedelic tune-in to the salon all at the same time someday. But those fantasies are for another day. Today I have a message to pass on to you that comes directly from Lady Ayahuasca herself. At least that's my take on it. Yours might be different, but that's what makes the world so interesting. In our next podcast, by the way, you'll hear Terence say, "The truth doesn't require your belief to exist, but hokum does." So here's my warning to you. If you've had the honor of receiving the gratuitous grace of Lady Ayahuasca, well, then you're going to probably understand this message as the way I'm going to try to pass it along. And if you've not yet had the opportunity to be under her spell, then you should probably treat this as hokum, just a product of an overactive mind. And perhaps it really is, but nonetheless, it makes sense to me, and you're going to have to be the judge of this yourself. So here's what happened. The energy in our circle was a lot stronger than usual that night, and yet our group was experienced enough and able to hold the energy well within the circle of our friends that were sitting together in complete darkness, as is our tradition, and listening to our dear ayahuasquero sing some beautiful acaros to the accompaniment of flutes, and even our own voices joined in from time to time when the plant so moved us. And I was gliding along on that lucid plane that manifests itself, shortly after the light show ends. I was trying to sort out the issues I'd raised as I focused on my evening's intention, but I wasn't really getting anywhere. I was just stuck in one of those crazy negative loops that you get into sometime if you're not careful. And so I was trying to get out of that loop when we entered into one of the several minute-long periods of absolute silence that we occasionally punctuate the evening with. And that particular time, the silence just hit me like it was a strong wind, and instantly my mind was just crystal clear, not a thought in it. And I don't know how long I remained like that, but a voice came from my left that broke the silence and said, "The future ain't what it used to be." The future ain't what it used to be. And in an instant, my mind began to laugh, and as the cosmic giggle expanded, it felt as if it was just wrapping itself around me, and then it suddenly squeezed me, and I got it. All of a sudden, I got it. And I think some of you can relate to those kind of moments. Now, for those of you who are just beginning to explore the realm of the psychedelic, if that nonsensical, insane rap doesn't scare you away with its total lack of what's commonly called reality, then maybe you've come to the right place. And for those of you who have been encouraging me to tell a few of my own tales, well, maybe now you can see why I hesitate. To be honest, I find most trip accounts to be not very interesting, except for the bad trips. I like to read them and learn what not to do. Anyway, even I can see how this fits into the hokum category, and I was there. So for me, this really happened, and and my words don't even come close to describing what took place. So I'll dispense with the how I got this message for you, and I'll just pass it along as best I can. Well, the first thing I got was a profound insight to that quirky little saying, the future ain't what it used to be. Of course, if the future remains what it used to be, then we're totally screwed. Our only hope as a species is to change course. And that's when Lady Ayahuasca began to speak. And here's what she said, as best as I can remember it. The people who are listening to these podcasts are beginning to understand that the Hopi prophecy that says, "We are the ones we have been waiting for," not only refers to each of you, you're also beginning to wake up to the fact that you've incarnated in this time and place for a very specific reason. A reason that we're all probably still really trying hard to uncover. And she went on to say that your instincts are probably a lot more accurate right now than your reason. And by the way, she said you should probably start expecting synchronicities to appear in your lives almost every day. She went on to say, please tell them that each and every one of them, and it was very clear that it was a specific each and every one of them, is vitally important right now. As Ralph Abraham pointed out, in normal times we should all go out and have fun and make piles of money. But these are not ordinary times, and this is where she got into a discussion of safety. And I won't go into all the details, but I was given a review of the lives of 4 of my very close friends during the past 9 months. All of them are dead now. 2 were suicides, and the other 2 had accidents with our sacred medicines. None of them should be dead right now, and each one of them was vitally important. Now all we have to learn from is their mistakes, because that's all they have left to give this enterprise that we're now so deeply engaged in. The point was that these were all highly experienced psychonauts, and all were over 40 years old. And right now, of course, our little clan is still in a state of shock over these deaths, but believe me, we have all abandoned any casual attitude we had about these substances, because we found out that a casual attitude really will cause casualties. So that part of the message was clear. Always get as much information about the experience you're about to have as you can, and start at Erowid's site. That's www.erowid.org. Erowid.org. I know almost all of the people involved in the Erowid project, and I can't speak highly enough about them. Erowid.org is truly an impeccable website, in my humble opinion. Now, I know that I've talked about safety before, and I'll continue to talk about it in future podcasts, but somehow this is a different kind of message I'm trying to deliver right now. Having been in entheospace, most of you know that the most important things you learn there are impossible to put into words. They're truly ineffable. And it's as much more than just a simple feeling. It's a deep grokking, if you know what I mean. And I'm pretty sure that you do, actually. The message really did seem to be directed personally to you, to each and every one of you. And I'm going to stop here because I don't want to keep on going in this airy-fairy mode, but to be honest, it makes me uncomfortable because I know it sounds like all that New Age stuff that I can't really stand. So let me say this another way. Forget the experience I had the other night. I'll just say this from me to you. And hey, maybe I should warn you, you ought to take everything I say with a grain of salt, You should probably know that I've kissed the Blarney Stone on more than one occasion, and I've been wrong a lot more than I've been right in my life, so you've had fair warning now about that. But this isn't Blarney. This is from my heart. And my personal belief is that, yes, this is it. It really is it. We're actually here for the big one, and why are we the ones that are so fortunate to be here at such a pivotal moment in time? Well, maybe it's because we've done this work for so many lifetimes now that we've earned our ringside seats for the big show that has already begun. I think it's hard to deny this if you really spent much time working and thinking about this issue, but the human species is now poised on the rim of a new chaotic attractor. And I don't think it's going to take much to tip this human slinky of consciousness into a new and improved basin of attraction. You know, there's been a lot of talk about the 100th monkey coming along, and personally I don't think it's even going to take that much. You know, there's a famous metaphor in chaos theory, which is what I believe is currently governing our state of affairs right now on this little planet. So according to this metaphor, the flapping of butterflies' wings in the Amazon rainforest can actually be the initial event in a cascade of events that eventually causes a hurricane. And I believe that the metaphor also works for all of you who are joining us here in the Psychedelic Salon. I think it would be wonderful if one of you becomes that 100th butterfly, you know, the one who gives our species its final little push that begins the next great stage in the evolution of our species. And I really hope it's one of you. And together maybe it could be all of us giving it that little push. So now I'll bet you guys who wanted some personal stuff from me are sorry, you know. Don't ask an Irishman to tell a story unless you've got a lot of time on your hands. And in my case, I hope you all keep in mind the fact that everything I know right now could very well be wrong. You know, it's happened to me before. Back in the 80s, before I first discovered MDMA, I was an Irish Catholic Republican lawyer. Today I'm still Irish, but no longer do I believe any of that bullshit I believed back then. Hardly any of it, you know. So my track record on having a beeline to the truth really isn't that good. So the only really good advice I can give you is to experience these things for yourself. You know, that's the big difference between religion and a psychedelic experience. One requires a belief, and the other's literally an experience. I don't know about you, but I'll take experience over belief any day. Well, that should be about enough for now. I want to thank you for being here again, and I look forward to joining with you to be sure that the future ain't what it used to be. Jacques, Cordell, and Wells, better known as Chateau Hayuk, thanks again for the use of your music, and we're all looking forward to the release of your new CD, which I understand is almost ready right now. So thanks again, and thanks to you, dear Terence. Thank you for being you. For now, this is Lorenzo, signing off from Cyberdelic Space. Be well, my friends.
Transforming musical linguistic objects, elf machines.
Greetings from Cyberdelic Space. This is Lorenzo, and I'm your host here in the Psychedelic Salon. Well, we're slowly coming to the end of this series of Terence Mckenna raps, and if you're joining us for the first time, I guess I should let you know that this is the 9th in what looks like it's going to be a series of 10 podcasts of sound bites from a workshop Terence Mckenna gave in the summer of 1998. When we left him in the last podcast, Terence was waxing eloquent about what happens to a seeker once she or he has found the magical essence of a true psychedelic experience. And as most of you already know, once you have ingested a large dose of, say, psychedelic mushrooms for the first time, well, there's simply no turning back after that moment. You know, because from that moment on, as my friend Tony Rich once said when he was keynoting an ayahuasca conference, we do know what we know. And now for those of you who haven't yet had a well-guided and profound psychedelic experience, there simply is no way to explain what an incredibly pure, crystalline, godlike experience this is. As Terence often said, you can spend the rest of your life sweeping out the ashram or following the rules of one of the paternalistic hierarchical religions that are tearing this world apart, or you can simply take the red pill and experience the truth for yourself. As I mentioned, I think in the last podcast, I was 42 years old before I mustered up the courage to find out if I'd been lied to, and I hope it doesn't take the rest of you so long to wake up yourselves. most of you have. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't even be tuned in here, would you? Well, that's enough from me right now. Let's listen to what the Bard McKenna has to say about how a great culture can lose its way.
It's a great puzzle how cultures lose their way. I mean, in the 20th century, we have the example of National Socialism in Germany. In the course of this weekend, we've talked about how Vedic India was based on the total celebration of some kind of psychedelic, and that it was lost, 100% lost, so that, there are a few pundits in India who claim they know what Soma is, but nobody can produce something which performs as advertised. Greater than Indra, greater than Brahma, shaper of the world, Soma. It's pouring forth from the Soma presses, gushing forth to intoxicate the multitudes. Well, what kind of drug is this, that you can have 3 daily pressings and intoxicate hundreds of people, and it has no reputation for anything except the highest state of ecstasy, and this goes on for 1,500 years, and then bingo, nobody knows what it is, nobody makes it, nobody can find it. It's just something talked about in old books. How do cultures lose their way? It's a hard thing for us to understand with our electronic obsession with, preserving everything, digging in colonial outhouses and cataloging the pottery shards and all this. We're savers of the past, but many times, several times in Chinese history, there have been enormous book burnings to basically dial back the cultural clock to zero and start it ticking again. The burning of the Alexandrian Library was an event like that in the West. I mean, there were over 1 million volumes in the Alexandrian Library, and the guy who burned it said that there are 2 kinds of books here. Those who contradict the Quran, they are heretical, and those that supplant the Quran, and they are superfluous. Let it all burn together. And that was the second burning of the Alexandrian Library. It was also burned by a Christian barbarian enthusiast called Alaric the Visigoth, the same clown who burned Eleusis behind.
I just have 2 brief questions. The first one, I just wanted to know more about the visual puns of the machine-like elves, or elf-like machines. And the second question is, I know of someone who recently went to Holland and they brought back some tryptophan, and I've read something in the literature about combining an MAO inhibitor with tryptophan, and I just wanted to know if you knew anything about the effects of that or anything like that.
Well, I think tryptophan is an MAO inhibitor. I'm not sure. Tryptophan is a common amino acid. If they're thinking of starting toward DMT, I think you can start from tryptophan, but I think it's easier to go from indole. As far as self-transforming elf machine puns, what exactly did you want to know about them?
Just if you could kind of elaborate on the 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional, 5, maybe give an example of, I know it's kind of hard to put into words, but.
Yeah, well, it's some kind of transformation of category, where things are made out of things which are impossible. I mean, as I said, how can something be made out of yesterday, consomme, and hope? It's impossible to conceive of something like that. And so, in the presence of these puns, they break down ordinary reality even more than it's broken down anyway in the DMT state. It's like, it's not enough that you're loaded on this psychedelic mega hallucinogen. Now they tell you crazy jokes, which you get in that state. It's sort of like the surrealists used this, saw the pun as a way of opening the crack between the worlds. And it would be a great challenge to artists to do this. I mean, the surrealist I'm thinking of who certainly leaned on this was René Magritte, where, foreground and background trade shape, and outlines of things are silhouettes of other things, and this sort of thing. Maybe it's a uniquely human capacity. I mean, we can argue about whether animals think or not, but I don't think anybody would give you much of an argument that they pun. There's very little evidence of that.
Terence, what about psychotherapy?
Well, I think anything which gets people free associating and talking freely and making previously hidden connections in their biographical material, in doing that in the presence of a skilled therapist. If the therapist then practices their craft with skill, it's hard to see how that isn't going to synergize the therapeutic process.
Is there a venue for that in this country?
You mean, are there people doing it?
Yes.
Well, it's very underground because giving people these things without an IND is illegal, and here you're dealing with people who are already self-defined as needing psychotherapy. But some of you may know that book, The Secret Chief, about a psychotherapist. To this day, those of us who know him don't use his real name in public. In the book, he's called Jacob. But Jacob was a guy who so strongly believed in psychedelics. He was a superb therapist to begin with, fully credentialed. And he taught hundreds of people how to do psychedelic therapy. And someday that story will be told, because I think that was the heart and soul of transpersonal psychology in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The joke on psychotherapy is whether you're Jungian, Reichian, Kleinian, whatever you are, 1/3 get better, 1/3 get worse, 1/3 stay the same. Well, I don't really think that's true of psychedelic therapy. And the psychedelic therapy, it's arguable, or it's a complex issue, whether it should be used in cases where people are severely disturbed. The people who seem to profit most from psychedelics taken in the presence of psychotherapists are people I would describe as the worried well. People who are anxious or have hit a block in their career or have a relationship coming apart, but these things happen to people. And, I know psychotherapists who I really believe probably 95% of every psychotherapeutic session they have with somebody changes a life for decades, if not forever. It's one of the great tragedies, and we've taught McCarthyism has been bared, and the blacklists in Hollywood, we've all done our mea culpas for that, and the Rosenbergs and so forth and so on. But we've never, as a society, dealt with the way science and human mental health care was sacrificed on the altar of government paranoia in the 60s in the name of repressing psychedelic drugs. I mean, there was work going on at Saskatoon in Canada with Humphrey Osmond and in other places. They were curing serious lifelong alcoholism with a single dose of 500 gamma of LSD in the presence of a psychotherapist. They were having incredible results, treating addiction, serious trauma, all of this stuff. Well, then that just went down the tubes. And the psychotherapeutic community didn't have the political muscle or the guts or something to resist that. the scientific community, which is very quick to tell government and everybody else to take their hands off. They can do anything they want with studying human sexuality. They can do anything they want with animal experiments. They can do anything they want. Well, they just totally folded on this drug thing. And, you know, my brother is a professional drug designer, molecular chemist, and his career, this whole story of his career is how unwelcome and threatened people felt by having good psychochemists in their presence. If you're going into medical pharmacology, stay away from psychedelics if you want to have any career at all. The number of people who've been able to overcome those barriers and make significant careers and do research and publish, you can count on the finger of one hand.
Is that true for the international community as well?
It's not as bad, but it's still, most of the world just doesn't deal with it. I mean, Germany, there's some people, chemists, other people interested, so some Swiss people. It's sort of traditional there, you know. I mean, try and name a psychedelic drug that wasn't invented within 700 miles of Berlin. It can't be done. But, you know, the Japanese make no contribution. The English make no contribution. The French make no contribution. It's just not looked at. Bizarre. Because the impact, you know, if you're a psychotherapist or a neurophysiologist or anybody else, the impact of giving somebody 200 micrograms of LSD, which is a vanishingly small amount of physical material, is just stunning. But it's not been pursued. Yeah. Ibogaine is interesting. Ibogaine is a psychoactive alkaloid that occurs in a plant, Tabernantha iboga, that occurs in Western Africa, in the armpit of Africa, in Gabon and Zaire, and it's used traditionally, although we have no record of it being used by anybody before 1850, which is kind of peculiar, because it looks like an ancient usage, like people have been at this for thousands of years. But the Portuguese have been in there since the 1430s, and there's no mention of ibogaine before 1850. It's a bush. You scrape the bark, you eat it, you hallucinate. The alkaloid is unique and psychoactive on its own. The reason research is being done in this country and it's being somewhat talked about is because the claim is made that it interrupts heroin and cocaine addiction dramatically. I wouldn't rush to sign up for that. I mean, it may. I think all psychedelics have this ability. It's not that ibogaine is a magic bullet for heroin addiction. It's that if you take a strong psychedelic and you're an alcoholic or a junkie or an abuser or fucked up in some way, it's going to be very hard to go through that trip without confronting this. And then you just say, you know, I'm killing myself, or I'm making the people around me unhappy and killing myself. And it's hard, once you actually say these words to yourself, not to form what good Catholics call a purpose of amendment, you know, to try and do better. So, you know, people say, well, this question of are we better people? I think it's possible to be a bad person and take psychedelics, but it's rare because it requires enormous powers of denial and ego. Most psychedelic people are pretty mellow because they're used to looking at the shadow and confronting the various facets of themselves and other people. It's a tolerant, gentle crowd, generally speaking.
If you look at you know, the records, we have millions of people, even in this country, who claim to have some kind of encounter. And studies of most of them that have been done have shown that they tend to be very what we would call normal people. A lot of them have had no previous interest in this field at all, housewives, accountants, and so forth. So from that point of view, and many of them have also been scientists or people who are credentialed in some way. So to dismiss them as, people who have had some kind of bias in that area, I think we'd have to delve into that a little bit more, as I'm sure you've thought about. Also, I just read an article that was pretty incredible where I think a former Air Force officer came forth and said that he had been responsible for planting technology from a crashed saucer in major corporations, in this country, and that was eventually reverse engineered, and a lot of people feel are responsible for the increased technology since World War II, including computer chip and a lot of other things that have come about recently and certainly revolutionized where we are right now. So I just, wanted to ask you again if...
Did you hear me right, is what you're wondering?
Yeah, right. I know your previous writings have been somewhat more liberal in that regard.
First of all, let me say, I saw a flying saucer. I saw it up close. I wrote about this in True Hallucination. But there is... Are you suggesting, you said millions of people believe they've been abducted. Are you suggesting that that you believe that millions of people have been abducted?
I didn't say abducted. I said had some encounter with, like yourself possibly.
By some encounter, if what we mean is that some people have felt the cosmic giggle come near, I don't think you can get through life without that happening. The problem I have is, first of all, this is hard to talk about, but maybe worth talking about. First of all, because of my position as whatever I am, I get to meet all these people off stage, so to speak. And it's not been a confidence-building experience. Also, I noticed you had a tendency in your question to lead with credentials. An Air Force colonel, a Navy officer, an ex-NASA scientist. I mean, when I hear the phrase ex-NASA scientist, I reach for my revolver. This is I think what we have to... First of all, nice people do not understand how mendacious, scheming, lying, and bizarre, pathological people are. They can't imagine it. That's essentially what being a nice person means, is evil is a mystery to you. I think that a lot of people are making a lot of money spreading anxiety. Anxiety is cells. And the earth change people, one by one, we tick past the Edgar Cayce prophecies that don't come true. One by one, now every piece of physical evidence from the first 30 years of the UFO phenomenon has now been shown to be fake. None of those photographs stand up under modern computerological deconstruction. And so my method, because I'm interested in the weird, the miraculous, the bizarre, the unearthly, the other. But my method has been to go to the place or the person or the thing and then not believe. Ask hard questions. And everybody else goes and believes. Well, the truth doesn't require your belief to exist. But hokum does. Hokum requires a relationship between the consumer of the hokum. And I've argued with Bud Hopkins, I've had lunch with Whitley Strieber, I've argued vociferously with John Mack, and these people are second-class thinkers. You would not send them to investigate a bus accident. I'm sorry that this is true. I didn't know this. I assumed, as most people do, that the word expert has meaning. It has no meaning. It's just a piece, it's public relations flackery. You're a UFO expert if you say you're a UFO expert. And when you go into so my method has been, as I said, to kick the tires and make it real. The other thing is, and people don't like this, but to examine the messenger. Is the messenger, you mentioned in your question, these people are normal, run-of-the-mill type people, accountants, lawyers, so forth and so on. In fact, when you look at these populations closely, they're weird. For example, the abduction population. A paper was written showing that the abduction population tends to cluster in middle-aged white women of the middle class who stay home. Well, what is that population, folks? That's the population of people who watch more daytime TV than any of the rest of us. If our average TV consumption is 5.5 hours a day, this population is pulling up the slack for those of us who don't watch and is watching 15 hours a day. And this is an area where, you see the newspapers being vended at the grocery store. Virgin Mom 9 gives birth to alien Christ. Are we all clear that this is a joke? All of us, including the remedial readers and the people who just got off the boat from Somalia last week, and everybody, are we all looking at it through the eyes of a Harvard intellectual with a BA in English literature? I'm not sure. So this is what I call the balkanization of epistemology. And part of it has to do with us all nobody, apparently this was left out of our curriculum recently, what's called rules of evidence. If you're a lawyer, you learn what are called the rules of evidence. What do a given set of facts actually mean? And in this UFO game, people, first of all, they repeat things. Never with citation. They say, did you see that article the other night, or that thing on Channel 6 a few weeks ago about this thing that happened in Argentina where and it's never accompanied by citation. So it's a multi-networked game of telephone where these rumors move out and are endlessly adumbrated and changed around. And all for the purpose of filling in people's blank spaces. And I don't like see, I think there are two phenomena. I'm not saying there aren't strange lights in the sky, that we may not know what they are and that they could be anything. But that's subject A. Subject B is the UFO community as a social phenomena. It's a paranoid community. These myths that are being propagated are always myths of disempowerment. It's that they came to Babylon and gave us an alphabet because we couldn't think it up ourselves. It's that they're giving us fiber optic technology and computer chips because we couldn't think it up ourselves. It's always about poor humanity receiving the largesse of the Space Brothers, and all we have to do is trade them human fetal tissue and some other stuff and they'll be happy. It's a backward fantasy that the media has drummed up into a hysteria. And if you really care about it, if it really speaks to you, then you must go and investigate it. You cannot understand it by consuming it from the media. Because all these people that you hear about, Jacques Vallée and Bud Hopkins and John Mack, the gods of this, Do you think they would stand out if they were sitting here in this room? Do you think if we had them in front of us that these would be towering geniuses or men of deeper insight than you and I? Get real. You know, it's just the New Age book circuit. It's just marketing and people making careers. Not that they're insincere, but that they're limited, as you and I are limited by our understanding and our past history. I was invited a few years ago to speak at a big UFO conclave in LA, and I had never been to one. And I thought, as I'll bet most of you think, who have a moderate interest in this, that if you go to one of these things, what you will find is a whole bunch of sincere people who have had strange experiences and who are trying to figure it out together. That is not what you find. What you find is booths, the Urantia book, Commander Rama, the Raelians, Billy Meyer, the Palladians, the Roswell incident. And these people operate side by side, having coffee, holding smokers for each other, and so forth and so on, with no sense of cognitive dissonance whatsoever. You know, it doesn't ever strike them that if the Raelians are right, then how can Commander Rama be right? And if he's right, how can Billy Meyer and this doesn't come up as an issue. And you realize these people are having a lot of fun. But they are not, this is a support group for some kind of fallout from a religious hysteria. This is not about the study of strange lights seen in the sky at night. And if you try to talk about that, people will just look at you like, who let you in? It's now all about channelings and prophecies and the rise of Atlantis and the beam from the center of the galactic whoop-de-doo and the photon belt and the coming of Malchut Sedek, if Maitreya will get out of the way, and on and on and on. And I find the only defense against this is the conjuring rod of irony and reason. If it seems absurd, it probably is absurd. Now, I'm not saying that the world isn't strange. I'm actually saying that the world is stranger than these cheerful UFO enthusiasts can even begin to imagine. The stars are so diffuse in space and time, the evolutionary time spans available to life so vast, that the idea that the alien intelligence will, communicate through sparkling-eyed, blue-eyed, middle-aged women with bold haircuts and muumuus is mind-boggling to me. And so it's just a matter of, how do you tell? And I have this argument with Ralph all the time, and Rupert, because they're both softer than I am. And I'm getting more hard-boiled in my old age because I see how a lot of people take all this stuff much too seriously and can't even really think straight. I read an interesting essay a few months ago in a book about all this by Douglas Stillings, and he said, when you encounter somebody with a strange belief, the question we have been asking the wrong question. The question we've been asking is, why do you believe this? Wrong question. The question we should be asking is, why do you believe that you believe this? Because the interesting thing is these people don't act differently than you and me. Somebody can claim they were an abductee and they did this and they did that. They don't act the way I would act if I were abducted. If I were abducted, I would come apart at the seams. Do you realize the implications of being abducted by an alien spacecraft? I don't think I would be satisfied to just tell my story to John Mack and become case number 232 and then sit back and let him handle the public relations fallout of it. These people do not behave as though their story was true. They behave as though it's a story. And so somehow what we're dealing with here is clashes of epistemic values. The Carlos Castaneda phenomenon was a good example. Half the people who want to talk about Castaneda want to talk about, is it true or not, or was this guy some kind of a charlatan? The other half says, what kind of a question is that? You don't even understand the issue. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. Well, without taking sides on that issue, notice that these two groups don't have much to negotiate, because for them the very notion of truth has taken on a different meaning. One is saying the truth of myth is truth, and the other is saying the truth of myth is a bullshit concept. We want to know if this is the truth or not. Yeah.
About psychotherapeutic use of psychedelics and the lack thereof in this country and in other countries. Do you foresee an increase of that with the decline of the nation state and the rise of the World Wide Web, as you've sort of laid it out?
A rise in psychedelic therapy?
Well, because from what I understood of what you were saying, one of the main reasons why that's been marginalized and pushed under and scheduled to the degree that it's been scheduled is because the nation state, it doesn't serve the nation state to have psychedelic activity going on a large scale. And so if nation states in the next 15 to 20 years go on the decline and are marginalized in their power and scope, and either corporations or global community take over, do you foresee a rise in psychedelic use in the medical
Yeah, I think so. I think, we talked about the world corporate entity that's emerging, that the world is being replaced from 200 nations to 1,000 corporations. The values are very different. Corporations are not particularly interested in suppressing dissent in quite the same way that nations are, because corporations don't argue their existence from a philosophical position. The other thing is corporations hate unregulated markets. And so I can imagine, drugs are a commodity, an enormous money-making engine. And it would be better for everyone, cynics, users, purists, manufacturers, physicians, governments, if drugs were simply an ordinary commodity, and if abuse of drugs was treated like any other mental aberration. Simply, you would be dumped into the mental health care system for treatment rather than criminalized and humiliated. It would be much cheaper for health care management and the legal system to treat it this way. Essentially, the situation now, the reason drugs are so severely repressed when it's such a money-losing proposition to do that is because the nation state is carrying out a vestigial obligation to the church, to Central European Calvinism. The reason drugs are illegal is because they're evil, fundamentally. Well, I think the corporate state will move beyond such theological claptrap and just say, well, they may be evil, but so is pornography, so are a lot of things that we traffic in with great gusto. The shift to the world corporate state is an ambiguous thing. The nation state used war as an instrument of national policy. Corporations don't do that. Yes, there is a large trade in armaments, and those arms are created by corporations, but armament trade is a small percentage of overall global economic activity. The world could live without corporations that produce armaments, and so could capitalism. The world corporate state is unfriendly to racism. In fact, it doesn't like any kind of boundary definitions in the customer class. It wants everybody to think of themselves as Joe Normal with the buying patterns and tastes of Joe Normal. What are the other differences? Well, it's non-ideological. You know, all the world corporate state wants to do is pick your pocket, which when you think of the political agendas we've survived in the 20th century, somebody who just wants to pick your pocket doesn't exactly sound too bad. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a difficult question because of when you have corporations, you have things that have to be manufactured. I've been dealing with the uprising in Chiapas, you know. Somebody has to make the stuff. There is a point where there are uprisings and where it is shut down, where there is great violence that occurs. We don't hear about it.
You mean violence at the behest of corporatism?
Indeed.
Yes, but it's nothing
and we have a
like
record of it. I mean,
it's
if you go to the
nothing
library,
like
you'll see
erasing the cities of Europe by aerial bombing or something like that. I agree. There's a low level of
it may be low level. It seems fairly high level where, you know, a company will go in and say, you know, Guatemala is becoming socialist. Let's go to the law firm. We'll hire the lawyers. They'll get in touch with the political people, and we'll go down there and, you know, assassinate whoever so that United Fruit can continue. That's just, you know, an easy example.
Well, if assassination is a tool of corporate statecraft, I've always sort of leaned toward assassination. Have you ever noticed how few innocent people get ground up in assassinations? I mean, if someone had assassinated Saddam Hussein, those 100,000 Iraqi soldiers who were buried alive in the pits in the desert might have lived to tell the tale to their grandchildren. But governments are horrified by assassination. Oh, Lord, no, you would never do that. The entire fabric of diplomatic understandings established since the Congress of Vienna would come unglued. Far better to conscript 1 million 18-year-olds and send them off to try to kill the leader by the fair rules of international diplomacy. The question, you know, capitalism is so triumphant now that its salvation will probably have to be self-generated. In other words, it's not going to come from slave uprisings or a papal encyclical, or it's simply that capitalism is going to have to grow smarter. And they're trying to do this. And once they smarten beyond a certain point, they will carry out what is essentially a Marxist analysis of their own situation and realize we can't keep doing this because the open system of exploitable natural resources that we are assuming doesn't exist anymore. And we can't lift everybody to the level of the American middle class without cutting down every tree and digging every vein of metal on the planet. Now there are always, as I've tried to stress in this weekend, there are always technological fixes. And it may be that there will be a technological fix for this as well. One thing we haven't talked about it at all, maybe it's been mentioned, but certainly not unpacked, is nanotechnology. You know, nanotechnology is something as mind-boggling as the internet or psychedelic drugs, and it isn't exactly related to either one of them. You all know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about these people, many of whom are clustered down in Cambridge and Boston, who propose that we're on the brink of an entirely new way of making things, that things can be made from the atoms up in chemical soups, that everything should be as small as possible. And these are people who have gotten, you know, 1,500 steam engines onto a 1 centimeter chip. The cover of Scientific American a few years ago had this 1 centimeter chip with over 1,500 steam engines on it. More steam engines than were operating in England at the height of the age of steam. Now, of course, each one of these steam engines produced 1/10,000th of a millinewton of force. Not much, but at the molecular level, enough to kick a tiny molecular gear into action or throw a switch or something like that. Nanotechnology is coming. It's so mind-boggling that they haven't spent any money on public relations, in other words, getting the people ready. So very few people realize how close this is. I mean, the AI may be off in the mists of time. Practical nanotechnology is already here. They make electric motors, 16 of which can fit inside a human hair. And what's envisioned is a world of aerosol dusts that are architected machines that are creeping over our bodies, through our bloodstream, in our houses, inside our larger machines. And everything is made of diamond, because diamond is the easiest material to manipulate at the atomic level. The holy grail of nanotechnology is something called a matter compiler. A matter compiler has its nose in a muddy ditch or an ocean estuary or something like that, and it essentially does to matter what Photoshop 5.0 does to images. Anything you want. So what's being brought in is a kind of sludge-like raw feed. It could be, in fact, in the nanotechnological future, the great real estate bonanzas will be toxic dumps. Because there you will send the nanotechnologically designed bacterial machines into the dumps, and they'll bring out the gold, the platinum, the phosphorus, the arsenic, atom by atom, and stack it up for you. You can have a closed resource cycle based on the standing crop of already extracted metals. People talk about abandoning agriculture. Because the populations of India and China will be fed out of matter compilers that turn seawater directly into rice. This could be done. How do we feel about that? Are we willing to give up agriculture if it means an entirely artificial food cycle for us, but the restoration of millions of acres of forest and prairie and meadow and grassland? These kinds of choices lie in the immediate future. Yeah.
When do time machines arrive from the future?
The question of time machines. Well, this relates to the speculation about the singularity. One scenario for envisioning the singularity at the end of time would be, here we've had this graph, which for millions of years has described the unfolding of process. And then at 2012, at this certain date in 2012, it reaches infinity, or it stops working. In any case, it indicates novelty becomes maximized at infinity, and then there is no more time. Well, trying to imagine various scenarios which would destroy time or obsolete time, one is a technology for moving through time, the literal annihilation of time by vehicular traversing of it. Time machines have a checkered intellectual history. Some people claim, with good reason, they're impossible. Other people claim they're only impossible under certain conditions. What's usually put against a time machine theory is, what's called the grandfather paradox. The grandfather paradox is, if I had a time machine and I traveled into the past, I could kill my grandfather. Then I wouldn't exist. Then I wouldn't have a time machine. Then I couldn't travel into the past. So how could I kill my grandfather? So this apparent logical contradiction is used to say that the travel is impossible. Notice it doesn't restrict travel forward, in the forward direction. In quantum physics, it's routine to handle, to send charges and qualities backward through time in these equations. And people have always said, well, it's just a mathematical convention. It doesn't really mean anything in the real world. Well, but how do we know? We don't know. As we approach the speed of light, according to Einstein's theory of relativity, time slows to nothingness. At the speed of light, time is at zero, eternity. If you were a photon, you would have no notion of time at all, but the universe would appear to be aging wildly around you, but you would have no sense of time passing. Are time travel technologies possible? A lot of people are beginning to think so. Some of them require almost godlike technologies. In other words, if you could spin a cylinder whose radius was that of the planet Saturn and whose longitudinal length was 10 times that, if you could spin it at the speed of light and you traversed its perpendicular axis, theory indicates you would be spun into the past. Well, we can't even dream of technologies like that, but it seems to indicate that in principle these things can be done. Some people believe there are black holes in the universe or wormholes that might be potential doorways to other dimensions. The wormhole theorists calculate what kind of energies it would take to pry open the mouth of one of these wormholes and hold it open long enough to push some information down it. Well, its materials, orders of magnitude more tensile in their strength than anything we can produce, but still not inconceivable in some far-flung future. My notion about a time machine is that it's not what it looks like. If you had a time machine and you used it and it worked, I think it would actually have the effect of causing the rest of the history of the local universe to happen instantly, because it would collapse the local assumption of a symmetrically evolving dimension. What I mean by that is, in order to keep the grandfather, well, here's the idea. Suppose you had a time machine that you had never used. You were the inventor of the first time machine. And on a certain day, you used it and sailed off into time, the future. Well, then the presumption would be, since you're the inventor of the first time machine, that just moments after that event, time machines from all points in the future would converge on your departure point. People who would come back to see the first voyage into time. This is presuming a universe where you can travel back into time, but only as far as the invention of the first time machine. This is the kind of universe I think we're living in, for no good reason other than this is what the mushroom told me. I said, is time travel possible? And it said yes, and I said into the future, and it said yes, and I said into the past, and it said only as far into the past as the moment of the invention of the first time machine. I said why, and it said because before that there were no time machines. Duh. So in that kind of a universe, when you sail back in time, get to keep the grandfather paradox from happening, I think all the rest of time happens instantly. So it becomes more like a God whistle, more like some kind of evolutionary fast-forward button, where you're somewhere in the historical continuum messing around with technology and society and this and that. Then you invent a time machine and zip, the rest of history happens in the next few milliseconds as the whole thing goes nova.
Well, how was that for a wild ride? I only noted the major topics that Terence touched on in those brief 50 minutes or so, and what I wrote down was how a great culture can lose its way, self-transforming machine elves, the secret chief and the story of psychedelic psychotherapy, UFOs and the UFO community as a social phenomena, the balkanization of epistemology, psychedelics in the age of the world corporate state, nanotechnology, time machines and the singularity. And when you realize that he's not using notes, that this is all coming right off the top of his head, well, to me it's even more amazing, and his use of the language I think is exceptional. But that was Terence. By the way, have you been thinking about synchronicity since I mentioned it last week? Well, here's one that happened just a few minutes ago. I just finished editing the talk that you just heard and was thinking about how far out Terence could get, talking about time travel and stuff like that, but from a rational, scientific, and yet very psychedelically philosophical point of view. And right then I decided to check my email before I recorded this segment, and as I was waiting for it to download, the thought popped into my head that I'd really give most anything right now to be able to hear a fireside chat between Terence and the man I consider to be really right out there on the far edge of consciousness research. And that's my good friend Zoe 7. And you probably know the rest of the story by now, don't you? Yep, the last message to come in was from Zoe. Don't you love it when things like that happen? When a little synchronicity like that happens to me, I explored a bit to see if there's a message somewhere in there for me. So I read Zoe's email with that in mind and noticed that one of the things he mentioned was a website that I suspect most of you have probably already heard about. It's David J. Brown's site, Mavericks of the Mind, and you can find it at www.mavericksofthemind.com. It's an interesting site that has interviews of many of the early luminaries of the psychedelic movement. And in the interview with Terence, I found the following McKenna-ism. He said, "We're moving towards something very much like eternal dreaming, going into the imagination and staying there, and that would be like a lucid dream that knew no end, but what had a tight, simple solution. The psychedelics, the near-death experience, the lucid dreaming, the meditational reveries, all of these things are pieces of a puzzle about how to create a new cultural dimension that we can all live in a little more sanely than we've been living in this dimension." I like that, don't you? So thank you, Zoe 7, for leading me to that. And by the way, if you haven't read Zoe's first book, Into the Void, you might want to do that soon. I think it's probably already close to becoming a classic. In fact, if you go to our palenquenorte.org site, and that's the corner of matrixmasters.com where these podcasts originate. So if you go to palenquenorte.org and navigate to the 2003 original Burning Man lecture series and click on the title of our first Palenque Norte lecture, you'll see some pictures of John Henna giving that talk, and there in the foreground is a copy of Into the Void that you can see in several of the shots. Maybe we're starting to reach so many of you now because of some extra mojo we got from Zoe way back there in the beginning, huh? Anyway, after you read Into the Void, you'll probably want to read his next book, which has just been published. and in a few weeks we'll be able to get a copy shipped from here in the U.S. Until now, the books were only shipping from Argentina, and the shipping cost was too high for most of us, yours truly included. So Zoe has fixed that, and soon Back from the Void will also be available in the U.S. with a very reasonable shipping price. And Zoe's main website, by the way, is www.zoe7.com, zoe7.com. And before long, he'll have a couple of new sites operating as well. I'll be sure to let you know when they come online. So I guess I should say stay tuned, if that's a thing you can say in a podcast, huh? One other little announcement I'd like to make is that Dr. Grobe would like to get the word out that he still needs 7 more volunteers for his psilocybin study at Harbor UCLA Medical Center. And now, before you get too excited, I need to tell you that the selection criteria is so strict for this study that you definitely don't want to qualify. You see, the participant population is restricted to stage 4 cancer patients who are also suffering from anxiety. And since stage 4 means terminal, less than a year to live, it seems to me that you'd have to be a little anxious. And you can get the details about this study at www.canceranxietystudy.org. So if you know of anyone who might meet the criteria, it would be nice of you to pass that URL along to them. Well, the next podcast will bring this series of Terence Mckenna talks to a close. And following that, we'll hear the talk that Nick Sand gave at the Mind States Conference in 2001, shortly after he was released from prison. So those of you who experienced the 60s might know of Nick, maybe not by name, but by the name of his most famous product, Orange Sunshine. Well, I guess that about does it for today. I really do appreciate you joining us all here in the Psychedelic Salon, and I want to thank you for all the kind emails you've sent. If I ever get caught up again after this move I'm in the middle of right now, I might even be able to answer some of you. But if you don't hear back from me right away, it isn't because I don't care. I do read everything that comes in. And so thanks again to all of you for being here, and thanks again to Chateau Hayuk for the use of their music here in the Psychedelic Salon. For now, this is Lorenzo signing off from Cyberdelic Space. Be well, my friends.
Transforming musical linguistic objects. Elf machines.
Greetings from Cyberdelic Space. This is Lorenzo, and I'm your host here in the Psychedelic Salon. Have you ever had one of those times when all of your tech just seems to conspire against you? And the sad part is that Mercury isn't even retrograde? Well, that's what's been happening around the old Psychedelic Salon lately. My plan was to get a better microphone and start producing more frequent programs, but as the fates would have it, a cascade of little changes to my system has resulted in a Niagara of problems, and the main one is that I can't get any microphones to work properly on my PC right now. So after several days of frustration, I decided to use my trusty SanDisk MP3 recorder to finish this program and get this podcast on its way to you before we all forget where we last left the good bard. And so it is that we finally reached the end of this long series of Terence Mckenna recordings. I hadn't planned on doing so many of them in a row, but I hadn't heard these tapes in a long time, and once I got started, I couldn't stop listening. And from some of the comments you've sent, I hear it's the same with many of you. You know, I keep telling myself that some night I'm going to self-medicate a bit and listen to all 10 of these McKenna Rhapsodies in a row, but I'm afraid that maybe my head would explode if I did. So, let's get on with it. Here's the 10th and final installment of a workshop Terence Mckenna conducted in the summer of 1998.
Yeah, machine is a very general term. I mean, the machine might be a mantra, a drug, physical position. This is the kind of stuff we were playing with at La Chirera. But I'm now afraid of it because I know that it's real. You have to believe you're going to fail to attempt to build a time machine, because no one in their right mind, if they thought it was going to work, would in fact climb into the gleaming saddle and slam the lever forward. You have to believe that you're going to fail, or you wouldn't do that.
I had a particular psychedelic journey where I was going into the wormholes and I was realizing, wow, if people really are serious about doing this, this is the way, because I was actually feeling like I was able to go wherever I wanted. But at that moment I refrained because, oh, wow, this is real. I can actually traverse through, the timeless singularities or the timeless wormholes and pop out at any point in space-time, because it's all interconnected at that one point.
The name of the game is to bring back real information. I mean, that's how you will convince the rest of us to do it and to believe you. And I think it can be done. I think probably shamanism is about this. But, I really, one of the things we talked about a little bit here, but maybe not enough, is this Bell non-local information space that seems to lurk beneath the surface of ordinary reality. For 50 years in quantum physics, this was denied as so counterintuitive and leading to such bizarre conclusions and possibilities that it must be impossible. And now they've done experiments that pretty much show this is real. This is real. And what it means is all the mystics of history were right. You can journey from any place in the universe to any other place instantly. You can extract information that lies on the other side of the cosmos instantly. It's all done in the imagination. The imagination is this sense which you have that is your non-local perceptor. Your local perceptors are your eyes, your ears, the surface of your body, so forth. The non-local perceptor is the imagination, and it's giving you a continuous holographic readout of the Bell non-local dimension, and it's like a cheat on your being trapped in the evolutionary cul-de-sac of Newtonian space and time. You are trapped in the evolutionary cul-de-sac of Newtonian space and time, but you have this little tiny peephole, this doorway into the entire cosmos. All the races that ever were there, all the catastrophes and civilizations and philosophies and messiahs and so forth and so on. But you have to tune it. 99.99999% of this Bell information is utterly incomprehensible to the human mind because it's on a scale too large or too small, or it involves premises or environments or presuppositions so bizarre that we can't grok them. But the remaining 0.0000001% of this data is absolutely fascinating. Beings, philosophies, works of art, ruins, planets, hierophanies, strange music, strange art, strange ideas, endlessly to be explored and then to be brought back as much as can be to the human camp and examine. I mean, we are hunters and gatherers in hyperspace as much as we are in 3D. And what we're roving and scanning for in those informational spaces is things which delight us or make life more comfortable or inform our relationship to each other or our environment. The future lies in the imagination. The imagination is going to get louder and louder and louder. William Blake saw this. we talk about virtual realities, designer drugs, downloading ourselves into circuitry, travel through time, disincarnate bodies, cloned identities, gender shifting, point of view shifting, all of these things. This is all about the rules of mind overwhelming the rules of physics. The rules of physics say, you are a body, you are on a planet, you have weight, you have momentum, you have specific gravity, you must behave like this and like this and like this. And mind says, no, I want to be pure, unleashed conceptuality. I want to be a thought blown in a hyperdimensional wind. I want to move from planet to planet with the twink of an eye. I want to know everything, see everything, be everything, feel everything, and then by that means, somehow, I will make my way back to my higher and hidden source. And who knows, maybe this always awaited us beyond the grave, and what we're doing, in some sense, is drawing death into the world and erasing that most profound of all boundaries. Distinctions. The distinction between life and death itself becomes thin, becomes transparent in these contexts. I mean, it's very easy to imagine technologies such that human identity will be scrambled beyond imagining. If you can download yourself into circuitry, you can make copies of yourself. If you can make copies of yourself, you can collage these copies and make selves that never were or might have been. You can have multiple identities. In one of Greg Egan's stories, people have this thing inside them that is implanted when you're 2 years old that's called, it starts out being called the dual, and it ends up being called the jewel. And what it is it's a thing which simply maps and studies your nervous system and creates a perfect copy in silicone of your being for the first 23 years of your life. Well, then when you're 23, you go through this ceremony where the body is vaporized, and the dual, this eternal copy of your youthful self, lives on. This is, within reach. Hans Moravec had the idea that you could nano-engineer bacteria such that you could nanotechnologically engineer a leprosy bacteria, because leprosy moves along the nerves from the point of infection. A bacteria that would lay down a thin wire of molecular gold along every nerve. And so you would undergo these operations where you would slowly be changed into a thing of gold and silicon, glass and arsenic. But there would be no moment of transition, no loss of consciousness, no speed bump, no transition of identity. It's just over time you would become something completely eternal and machine-like. That poem by William Butler Yeats, Sailing to Byzantium, where he says, "Once out of nature I would be a thing of gold and gold enameling, set before the lords and ladies of Byzantium to sing of what was and what will be. Once out of nature," what he means is when I am dead, I will be a thing of gold and gold enameling. There's the image of the flying saucer coming out of the collective unconscious. We want to become the stone. We want to become somehow a living thing that is nevertheless has the character of machinery and objectification. It's a very complex image in the human mind, with Christ at one end of the spectrum and the universal medicine of longevity at the other end of the spectrum, and then all these adumbrations and resonances, the philosopher's stone, the grail, the gift difficult to obtain, the magical object, the talking stick, the jeweled self-revealing basketballs of the DMT state. In the 53rd fragment of Heraclitus, he says, the aeon is a child at play with colored balls in eternity. And, this makes no sense until you smoke DMT, and then you find yourself in the presence of the aeon, the archon of the world age. It's a child at play with colored balls in some kind of a virtual reality. Yeah.
I have two questions before the whole workshop ends up. But one of them is if you could talk a little bit about the tone that you and Dennis used to intercalate tryptamine molecules in DNA, how you decide to use it, that particular tone, if it's occurred again in your life, what it may mean to you, as well as just a brief comment on gender ratios in your workshops, whether there's more men than women usually. You've talked a little bit about that before. I've heard you say that men may be more drawn toward the psychedelic experience because of some lack of intuitive knowledge about
Yeah, well, I don't know why exactly it is. It certainly seems true that men have a deeper relationship to drugs than women. I think that's generally true. Even hard drugs. Women don't seem as interested in drugs or as potentially addicted to drugs. Maybe there's a deeper survival instinct there. Women are constantly burying the dead, caring for the sick, giving birth, helping with miscarriages. They may be more rock-bottom realists. Well, the guys are harping 100,000-line oral epics and stuff like that. I think, I quoted this statistic in a different context, but that in 1800 the average American woman gave birth 13 times. Giving birth, especially in a world without anesthetic, is a pretty psychedelic and boundary dissolving and ego erasing and whoop-de-doo kind of experience. I think women may, in traditional societies, not care to contextualize psychedelics simply because they have enough on their hands. I don't know the gender, there's a lot about gender stuff I'm interested in, but I don't understand. My friend Brenda Laurel studies girls and why they seem to have some difficulty naturally acclimating to the internet, and how boy and girl, male-female mathematical abilities seem to differ, although I think that's changing. I think the latest data is that women are pulling even with men in mathematical graduate schools, at least in some places. I don't know, men are, and maybe this is cultural or maybe this is biological, but men are maybe more boundary defined than women. Like women seem, and again, you make these statements, you don't know whether you're making a biological statement or a cultural statement, but women seem more tolerant of bisexual and homosexual behavior. They're sort of comfortable with all that, where male sexual encounters are always defined to some degree by competitiveness or, the hidden shadow of competition. Now, what was the other part of your question? Oh, about the tone. Well, this is a very specific question, but in the story that's told in The Invisible Landscape, Dennis seemed, as he went around the bend, to have insights into these, like, shamanic techniques that were real techniques, and that he could not only tell you what they were, he could tell you how they worked. And one of the things he insisted upon was that you could use your voice to transduce energy into your own body and other people's bodies, which this is no news. Acoustical signals are a good way to transduce energy across space. But that you could actually use it almost like a acoustical laser or something like that, and that you could interfere with the normal chemistry of these drug molecules and make them enter into bonding situations that they would normally not have affinity for the bond. You do this by making them superconductive. You make them superconductive by stilling their molecular motion. We tend to think of absolute zero as a temperature, but in fact, when an atom is still, from a physicist's point of view, it's at absolute zero. At absolute zero, the normal rules of bonding are canceled, and these things become like sticky. They'll bond to anything. And so he said you could use voice to form a relationship of the geometric incident of the angle of attack of the incoming acoustical wave as it encountered the molecular matrix, that it would cause some of these molecules to become superconducting, and that then they would bond permanently into the bond site of activity, and that instead of having a transient psychedelic trip, you would lock this stuff in. And he envisioned the harmine molecule, which has these two Mickey Mouse-like ears of benzene rings hanging off the pentexyl structure of the center. He visualized them like vibrating antennae. And he said, you will land these molecules into the nuclear cleft of the DNA and then bond them in with this acoustically generated sound, and then forever after, the person that we do this to will have a standing waveform holographic image in their imagination of the sum total of space and time. It was like he said, you'll get this image of the universe that will be sort of like your interface to the big internet. The internet where every star is a website, and the sound that you were to make to cause this to happen was the electrons, an octave or a harmonic of the electron spin resonance of the harmine molecule in your system. And it is true that that a significant percentage of the people who take ayahuasca report a loud hum. A hum. It was a hum. And so he felt that by imitating these molecular hums and tuning through them, that you only, according to him, you only had to make the right sound for a few milliseconds. So the doing the scales was an effort to hit all possible sounds, knowing that when you got it right for just a few milliseconds, it would lock in. And so these sounds sounded somewhat like this. And then he somehow was able to keep going, and then he would start over and do this, and he called this the strum. And it would not have been worth talking about 32 years later or whatever, except that it seemed to work. It caused him to go spectacularly bananas, and me to go arguably nearly as spectacularly bananas. And in a way, that trip we've never come down from. I mean, I'm not saying that as I sit here I am in contact with the eschaton or the spinning violet torus of hyperdimensionally stored holographic information. But on the other hand, I feel a very strange, weird connection to those times, probably because he put all kinds of strange suggestions into my mind. I mean, at one point he said, we can never leave this place. We'll never leave this place. He said, but we have to fashion an image and send it forth. We have to send forth holographic images of ourselves. And I've often wondered, am I still down there, rising at dawn to walk the grassy pasture loaded out of my skull? And, this is all some sort of, it's all a dream, actually.
After that experience, you said before, I've heard that you felt the mushroom gave you your powers of locution or memory, and that's something that you didn't have access to before.
It certainly oiled my tongue. It did. And when psilocybin facilitates language. I mean, it wants to be expressed. Henry Munn's essay that I mentioned to you makes this clear. Yeah.
A couple weeks ago, I was giving a talk at the World Future Society in Chicago, and it was entitled Beyond Alternative Medicine. And in that talk, I bring up the internet, and I talk about the shift from the industrial paradigm to the information age and all that kind of stuff. And I was presenting that, and I was going down the list of the industrial things: massification, to customization, quantity to quality, hard resources to soft resources. And as I was looking at the list of the industrial age and the information age, the thing that came off was, it was almost like masculinity moving to femininity. And I said to myself, you could almost look at these columns in front of this group as testosterone loaded and estrogen loaded. And then I says, what in the hell is a man supposed to do with testosterone in the information age? So I throw that out at you, and, how do we fit in as, hunters and gatherers in the information age?
Well, the internet is a large and multi-level forest environment with all kinds of... I think there's a place for the stealthy and the swift. I think it's a place where steely-eyed courage pays off, and chance-taking is rewarded. We're probably, this whole gender thing, it's locked into the way we're focused on identity. I would think probably we're on the brink of I'm not sure I would say transcending gender, but having a different relationship to it as we have a different relationship to our bodies. And in the future, it will be thought absurd for people to think of themselves as heterosexual, homosexual, exclusive this, exclusive that. After all, Freud showed that our fantasies are almost always contain counter elements to our expressed choices, gender or otherwise. And I think, hyperspace is going to give a lot of space for acting out, and it's harmless acting out. It doesn't shake the social boat. How we deal with our sexuality, because it's at the center of our biological nature, is going to be one of the most interesting things about how we manage cyberspace. The things that are usually put against cyberspace is that, people just become lumpen and they never leave the keyboard and they're not interested in smelling the roses, still less in making love. That's objection number one. Number two, people just spend all their time fantasizing and looking at pornography and making distant friends in different places under false pretenses. So it seems to be it's either it's too sexy or it's not sexy enough. Howard Rheingold got taken to lunch 1 million times for inventing the word teledildonics, which always gets a laugh, but teledildonics is nothing more than sexual prosthesis extended over space and time. And it's interesting to me that pornography is the most successful business on the net and drives technological innovation, because they're the only people who actually care about having the server always up, having the downloads occur fast, having the real audio not flicker, having the sound of high quality. They keep pushing the platforms and upgrading. Sexuality without being anchored to biology is naughty in the Western canon of values. But nevertheless, for quite some time, naughtiness has held a real fascination for large numbers of people. And virtual reality, people want to act out strange fantasies. Should you feel guilty about a fantasy acted out with pieces of software rather than poor, hard-working prostitutes? Is it a more horrifying thing, a less horrifying thing? Shouldn't even be mentioned? What is our relationship to the eroticization, potentially, of our technology? Is that healthy? Is it not healthy? We don't know. I mean, for crying out loud, we're barely 80 years from Freud, and now look what we're going to have to deal with. On one level, the way to think of the Internet and what it is it's simply the collective unconscious is becoming conscious. They're draining the water out of the bathtub, and suddenly the toys that were hidden there are now to be seen for all to behold. And we're squeamish about this because our culture is based on the myth of niceness and gentlemanly and ladylike behavior and so forth. Still, this is a huge echo for us. And, we designate certain clubs, certain holidays, certain drug states as permission to transcend the normal strictures of bourgeois behavior. But, what outrages conservatives about the net, for example, in the area of pornography is, pornography used to be urban. It used to be you had to go to some seedy section of town and mingle with seedy characters. Now, every living room in America can have endless amounts of pornography that would stand your hair on end. Well, what's happening is an erasure of the previously print-created domain called public spaces. And people wanted private property and public spaces, and certain business was confined to one area and certain to another, and the Internet is neither public nor private space. I play around with See You, See Me and iVisit technology, which is a technology of using small TV cameras to conference with people at a distance. Well, you often go into these reflectors where many people are making appointments to see other people, not you, and people don't know how to handle the technology. They leave switches on they shouldn't leave on, and so forth and so on. And you'll log into a place where there are 11 guys. 4 seem to be masturbating, but not in a particularly exhibitionistic way, sort of half-heartedly and lackadaisically. And then other people, you can see them, they're staring at screens. And you're wondering, do I look like that? Am I staring at a screen? Are they watching the people masturbating? What is the relationship between these people? Is this an invited situation? Is it a situation of voyeurism? Or is it a situation of domestic carelessness where this guy forgot to turn off his software? And you realize these are the frantic questions of someone enraged by the breakdown of public space. You say, I don't understand what's happening here. Are we in a private space? Are we in a public space? Can people see us? What do they think? What's happening? It doesn't make any sense. You just have to go with the flow. I don't know what those people are doing.
Do most people who take DMT have the same encounter with the machine-like elves? And if so, how similar are they? And then also I'm wondering what your relationship is with law enforcement. Is that fine?
Well, the first question, everybody's different, and everybody takes the dose differently and gets a different amount and brings different baggage to the train station. Having said all that, I think if the dose, the stronger, the higher the dose, the more everybody's experience converges. If people get 50 to 70 milligrams in a big hit, they will go to the realm of the self-transforming machine elves as described by yours truly. They may not describe it as I do. I've turned a number of people onto DMT. I've listened to a lot of stories, and slowly the image that has emerged for me, if you want to think of the DMT place as an archetype, it's the archetype of the circus. The circus is a very complex archetype. It's a rupture of plane of the bizarre and the transmundane, which shatters bourgeois expectations. The circus comes packaged in several ways. First of all, it's a great place for children. Clowns, animals, bright music, cotton candy, the hurdy-gurdy, and the calliope. Great place for children. But also, the circus traditionally packaged and marketed eros. I think my earliest intimation of sexuality and eros was when I was a creature so small that I was wrapped in a blanket and handed from shoulder to shoulder. And I was taken to a circus, and I saw the woman in the nearly naked, perfect woman in the little spangled costume hanging by her teeth up in the top of the tent, spinning around and around, working without nets. But I imprinted this thing very strongly, and I got the feeling of the fear of death, the beauty of youth, the risk of performance, the glamour of it. So that's part of DMT. Clowns. DMT is always characterized by clowns, They arrive in a tiny automobile, exploding and chugging. 15 of them get out, huge noses, huge shoes. They're poking each other in the eye. They're dropping anvils. They're flinging irons around. But then just off the center ring, it gets weird. The goat-faced boy, the thing in the bottle, the hermaphrodite, the harlequin, it's all this strange stuff. And then every child worth their salt wants to run off with the circus. The circus represents such a countervailing force to middle-class respectability and small-town rules and so forth. You want to run off with the circus. I remember when I was a kid, the town I grew up in, every 4th of July was the big festival of the town, and a carnival would come. And our parents would tell us, you can't stay out after 9 o'clock at night while the carnival is in town. Well, why not? Well, you just can't. These carny people are different. They're, a little darker shade than most of us. Some of them might use drugs. Some of them may, God forbid, have once been divorced. I grew up in the 50s. Things were pretty screwed down. And then when the circus would leave town, of course, reality would seamlessly close over it. Where it had been in the city park would once again be a place for Kiwanis picnics and football practice. So the archetype of the circus is, I think, the ruling thing of DMT. It's made me a fan of Fellini's circuses. His wonderful circuses are very DMT-like and have everything I'm talking about, the erotic, the humorous, the menace, the shadows, and the light. As far as my relationship to law enforcement is concerned, I'm happy to say I don't have any. It disappoints people, especially conspiracy theorists. Of course, they can assume I'm lying. But nobody has ever bothered me. Years ago, I was a hashish smuggler, and then they did bother me. They indicted me when I was in India, and I had a whole opera as a youth, and had to come back and work all that out. But that was all settled by the mid-'70s. Why do I not have a relationship to law enforcement? In other words, why don't they watch me, bother me, tell me to shut up? I mean, it's sort of disappointing to people to hear, I think, because I love it when people come up and congratulate me on my courage and say, we're so happy that you're doing what you do. It must take enormous courage. No, I think if it took enormous courage, I probably wouldn't be doing it. I just have made an assessment of how things work, and my assessment seems to be right. And here's how they work. Eggheads don't count in America. It doesn't matter shit what we say here. What drugs are about in America is money from the law enforcement point of view. You can bet your booties that if in the next year I cleared $1 million in untaxed money dealing drugs, I would have trouble. You would have trouble too, probably, unless you're already in the mafia or something and you've got it wired. They hate not getting their cut. And psychedelics generally have not been big money makers. They're not addicting. And so they've always been a side issue for criminal syndicalism. The criminal syndicates that have marketed drugs, psychedelic drugs, with the possible exception of cannabis, have just basically done it for humanitarian reasons. There's lots more money to be made in heroin and cocaine and MDMA and all these things than in true psychedelics. Usually, the only time you meet idealistic criminals is when you meet psychedelic chemists and the people who distribute their wares. Because if you're good enough to make LSD, you're certainly good enough to make methamphetamine and cook up all kinds of scaggy drugs. So it's not a good idea to make money with drugs, I think. I think that people are entirely too willing to police themselves. The Internet is solving some of this problem by creating an incredible forum of information where, when I was a kid, if you wanted information about drugs, it was like the most forbidden thing imaginable. Now you just log on to lyceneum.com or the maps page, or if you go to my website, there are buttons there to enormous ongoing discussions. 30 posts a day to the salvia list, 30 posts a day to the ayahuasca list. You can't possibly churn through all this stuff, let alone the vast amounts of material that have been archived and articles transcribed and stuff like that. So the net, the web, which empowers all fringes, especially empowers fringes where information has previously been restricted. And I think, that's why I'm shoulder to shoulder with these pornography people. I mean, some pornography may be odious, but if you let the Calvinist mentality start digging there, the next thing you know, it'll be drug information and then sexual, contraceptive information and then certain political points of view and on and on. And it just can't be that way. No nation state can set an agenda. And pornography is the least, the most discussed and least offensive of the world's problems. I mean, my God, we have serious problems. Let's put control of pornography. And I mean by adults, for adults. Child pornography is odious, of course, but pursuit of child pornography is a rare pathology, I choose to believe. Yeah. Actually, I don't know anything about all this. I'm sort of conservative. My approach is not to try every drug that comes down the pike, but to just use the drugs that work for me quite a bit. So I'm aware of things like what you mentioned, and DEPT, and there's another one, but I won't be in the first charge to try all those things. because I'm pretty happy with my circumstance. If I were depressed or bipolar or something, I would certainly medicate it. I think it's really crazy to think that pathological traits are somehow character building or to be treasured as a charming part of one's personal toolkit. I think they should just throw that stuff out of the rowboat and become a more bearable person. But my ignorance of these things doesn't mean they're not important fields. Obviously, the rest of our future is going to be chemically engineered, and drugs, pseudo-neurotransmitters, enzymes, immune stimulants. There's an endless potential market for all of this stuff, and not all of it will be hype. Some of it will actually be change our lives, like Viagra, for example, or Prozac. I mean, we kid about these drugs, but if in fact Prozac is the most prescribed drug in the world, maybe that's why things have seemed to me to be running rather smoothly recently. A whole bunch of people who would be moping in their beer or snapping or dragging their tail or not cooperating are in fact cheerful, bright-eyed, and bushy-tailed. And Viagra, it can't hurt that people are having more orgasms and more profound sexual encounters with each other. And at some point, these fixes, chemical and informational fixes of our lifestyle, have got to feed back into greater happiness, or what's the point of it? Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment before when you were talking about the question about the similarity in DMT experiences. And I remember the first workshop I saw you at was about 5 years ago, and I had done quite a bit of psilocybin and LSD, but never DMT. And I heard you talking about coming into contact with the alien and the visual language. And I guess I was quite skeptical because it just seemed like it was a lot of romanticism. And then I had my experience, and it was all there. These jeweled basketballs, the carnival-like quality. So it kind of was the evidence for me that it was more than just a vague memory of a trip, that it was really something outside of our own consciousness, that we weren't creating it and experiencing some variation on our past. So
yeah, I mean, something, we talk about DMT and all this. Remember, it's just 3 tokes away, and it only lasts 10 minutes. So your major problem, I suppose, is accessing it. Well, why are you sitting here, for crying out loud? In other words, if you worked at accessing it 24 hours a day, how the hell long would it take before you accessed it? I'm sure there are people in this room who could help you. So if you didn't meet them this weekend, well, then you wandered in the wilderness. What were you doing? Sitting by the brook, browsing in the bookstore? You blew it. It's to be sought. And what? Well, it's an intelligence test. That would give it away. You're supposed to figure it out. My notion is, once I have performed my job, which is telling you this stuff exists, and I tell it in such a dramatic way that you're supposed to doubt me. And so then the only way to prove that I'm full of it is to go out and find this stuff, smoke it, and then come find me and tug at my wrist and say, I smoked it, and nothing, or whatever. And one person in 20 will be able to do that, but the other 20 will come, with flowers, offerings, incense, and the sound of yellow brass, because this is there, and it's a real thing. I mean, if I were to tell you that you should go meet the flying saucers, or go find Atlantis, or go find Bodhi Mind, for that matter, it's a pretty tall order. Where do you begin? But finding DMT, It's matter. It's an object in this world. If you wanted a print by Hieronymus Bosch, you'd know how to proceed. If you wanted to buy the Koh-i-Noor diamond, you'd know how to proceed. If you needed a Mercedes, you'd know how to proceed. If you wanted a first edition of the poetry of E.E. Cummings, you'd know how to proceed. Why do you have so much trouble figuring this out? Just proceed as you would in the pursuit of any other defined material object. Basically put the word out that money is no object. And I'm sure you'll be amazed at how the market responds.
I'm wondering, I find my balance in meditation, and psychedelics have given me tools, I think. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for preparing ourselves for this evolutionary acceleration.
You mean practical tools? Basically, in the short term, I don't eat for 6 hours. I don't call that fasting. I just call it emptying my stomach. I don't fast because I get dizzy and have headaches, and why fast? It's going to work anyway. But I don't eat meat or greasy food and sugar and stuff like that leading into it. I fast for 6 hours, and then I do it in a quiet, secure, not likely to be interrupted space. And so those are the short term, and I smoke cannabis on psychedelics. I navigate with cannabis. I cannot imagine taking psychedelics without cannabis. In fact, wouldn't. That would just, if there was no cannabis, that would be the problem to be solved, and we couldn't think of getting loaded until we had that nailed down. In terms of longer-term preparation, how do you really prepare? By cultivating wonder, imagination, and curiosity. Curiosity is really the psychedelic impulse in the absence of psychedelics. If you like to look at things, paintings, ants, bugs, butterflies, flowers, and, pay attention. Look at things. And then the other thing is love knowledge and love the weird. Love the fringes of knowledge. I said at some point in this weekend that the alien intelligence is a collagist. It can work. The more you put into your head, the more far out your trips can be. There are people so lumpen that you give them DMT and they come down with the standard stereotype of the psychedelic drug taker. Pretty colors. Well, you have to be pretty dumb to come away with the impression that all there was pretty colors. So, read strange stuff. Go to strange places. There's an old alchemical saying, something like this. The highest mountains, the wildest deserts, the oldest books, there will you find the stone. And so it's all about, the common opinion should be rejected on principle. I mean, this sometimes makes you seem kind of quirky because everybody's running toward fish and you're talking about buxtehude. Everybody's interested in sushi and, you want fermented mare's milk. But usually you find out that by behaving in this way, you end up ahead of the curve. And life is beautiful without psychedelics. Psychedelics simply make you aware of that primarily, and then secondarily lead you deeper into it. The affirmation of psychedelics is not the affirmation of an ideological position or a moral point of view. It's the affirmation of the existence of beauty itself. The pursuit of psychedelics is the pursuit of beauty. The taking of psychedelics is a religion of platonic beauty. To know that it exists and to live one's life in the shadow of that knowing is transformative and carries us and the rest of evolution forward. So that's the weekend, folks. That's the wrap. Thank you very, very much.
And so dims the voice of the sweet bard McKenna. Didn't you love the part where he said that the best way to prepare for a psychedelic experience is to cultivate wonder, imagination, and curiosity? And isn't that exactly what we're all trying to do here in the Psychedelic Salon? At least I hope it is. Which reminds me, I wanted to comment on something else Terence said that kind of disturbed me. It's something I don't think he made very clear. And that was when he said, if you didn't make a connection this weekend, you blew it. Well, I've got to take issue with that, at least the way it sounded. When I heard Terence say that just now, I thought of all the times my friends and I have met new people who are way too overeager to make contacts. And if you're smart, you'll be leery of over-friendly people yourself. Now, I don't mean this to be a downer, but you've got to be careful out there. You know, here in the Psychedelic Salon, we're exercising our First Amendment rights of free speech and talking freely about psychedelic medicines. But we're not going to be talking about where or how to find these sacred medicines, because I truly believe that when your mind and spirit are properly prepared and ready, they'll magically manifest themselves to you. You know, it happened that way for me, and I've seen it happen that way many times since. So be patient and take your time to get to know people, and more importantly, let them get to know you. You know, I have a personal rule of thumb that if somebody asks me if I can help them find one of our sacred medicines, and if I haven't known these people really for at least a year or more, they immediately go on my suspected narc list, and most likely they're not ever going to become close friends of mine. I know that's kind of a cold thing to say and do, but there's no room for error right now. So be careful. Be really careful out there. You know, a few years ago I was told that 90% of all drug busts come out of traffic stops, and the other 10% were from friends who rolled over on them. So be warned, don't drive with or under the influence of these substances, and be very careful about making new friends, particularly when you only know them through cyberspace. Enough said. So, why do we take these risks? Well, maybe it's because if we use these sacred medicines the right way, then they do what Terence said. Psychedelics make you aware of the fact that life is beautiful without psychedelics. It's true, you know, life is beautiful, and for me it's even more beautiful with all of you being here with us in the Psychedelic Salon. And although Terence didn't end this particular workshop the way I've heard him end several others, I think it might be fitting right now. So, in the words of the bard McKenna, keep the old faith and stay high. For now, this is Lorenzo signing off from Cyberdelic Space. Be well, my friends.